In an unknown oasis of the southern desert lay a family of flame-horned oryxes that stood erect by a lake. In that lake were a few eternally warring species consisting of electric squid, stone-scaled alligators and dual-headed tortoises could be seen thrashing about. They were all different species that often battled for supremacy, but there was one thing that they shared at this fatal moment. Bone-shaking terror. They couldn't see it, but they knew it. Something terrible was after their life. The family of oryxes didn't dare to wait anymore and they made a mad dash to the edges of the oasis, not waiting to see the cause of their fear. Unfortunately, the cause of their fear was very interesting in making its acquaintance. A thick gray mucus-like substance rose up from the ground and gathered together again in the appearance of the slime abomination. Driven by its new voracious need to absorb lives, the abomination returned to the surface. With its peak ninth stage of the third realm capabilities on top of its abomination perks and Domicus treasure effects, finding lives was extremely easy. It just so happened that the beasts in the oasis were the closest. What happened next need not be explained. The abomination massacred every single beast with none of them being able to escape. But what happened next spelled the tale of the abomination amongst abominations. Not only did the beasts not dissipate into ash, product of becoming an abomination, but the corpses were consumed and absorbed into the slime, gaining the skills and certain body parts of the victims. Sure, all abominations consume other life forms for the vital essence, life force/vitality, that alleviate their pain, but none of them should have the ability to assimilate other life forms into themselves in its entirety. It could never be certain, but this was most likely the result of the two conflicting Domicus treasures. And what was the result? Wiggling tentacles that stuck out of the slime's body, multiple eyes that seemed to belong to different races and a few horns here and there. Sometimes, a leg or claw would even pop out, showing the abomination's instinctive control over the abilities and body parts that it gained from its victims. At the very least, the abomination didn't look like some amalgamation of different creatures because of the fact that each additional body part looked like they were a natural part of it. They were made out of gray slime with some of them being of a lighter or darker shade. For example, the multiple eyes that were of a lighter shade of gray. This could have been slightly bearable. After all, like every other abomination, the slime had suffered a massive blow to its intelligence when it went through its abomination transformation with only three things occupying its thoughts: murder, massacre, and genocide. Such a thing would have prevented this menace from being truly great. Sooner or later it would have been felled by an innovative trick and that would be the end. But unfortunately, when the slime absorbed the strength, defense, agility and other such things from its victims, intelligence was not lacking. It couldn't be seen because of the lack of transparency, but there were multiple brains inside the slime with all of them complementing each other. Not only was this abomination not the slightest bit dumb, but it was already smarter than someone like Reiko the Beast King, and all it had to do was consume more victims to become even smarter, stronger and faster. This abomination was certainly not the useless kind that could only suffer till death in vain, and was not even the glass cannon kind that had all the power but no defense. This was a 1/100000000 calamity grade abomination. The abomination of abominations and destroyer of worlds. If something wasn't done, the world was finished. 1 year later, a third of the life on the continent had been eradicated by the abomination and the plant life was included. At this point, the abomination was a lot stronger than its cultivation portrayed, and it already had the strength of a fourth realm being. The only reason it had not broken through yet was because of the suppression that Eridel had placed on all life forms, preventing them from breaking through to the fourth realm without his supervision and doing the stupid shit that the abomination was doing now. The only reason it was still getting stronger was because of the powers and abilities that it directly absorbed from its victims. Even now, it was still killing and becoming stronger with seemingly no limit. Gray-colored fireballs, icicles and lightning bolts struck panicking humans with pinpoint precision. The abomination was currently in a human settlement that it had found and was doing what it did best, killing. In mere seconds, the population of over 12,000 humans was reduced to 10. But for some reason, it did not kill the remaining humans. Instead, it watched them with an eerily calculative gaze. It was much more harrowing when you considered the multiple eyes. Suddenly, a minute chunk of slime the size of a head was split off from the abomination. Strangely, it started bouncing and looking around with curiosity as if it was a separate being from the abomination. A few of the abomination's eyes were trained onto it with laser focus and zero emotions. This was the first time that it was using this technique. A technique that it could have used before, even before it became the abomination that it was now. Reproduction. A technique that enabled a slime to split a part of itself to form a new slime with its own consciousness. The fact that the abomination was giving birth was already worrying, but in quick succession, 9 more newborn slimes were produced like it was nothing. Making a decision, the abomination used its progenitor bloodline to exert complete control over the newborn slimes. The slimes wiggled or hopped to a human each. It truthfully wasn't hard when all 10 of the humans had passed out from fear, or more accurately the terrifying aura that the abomination was emitting. When the 10 slimes had made contact with a human, the abomination forced them to use the same skill that he had been using all this time. Assimilation. For a moment, nothing happened. The newborn slimes only wiggled intensely as if suffering in pain. But suddenly, the slimes deformed before slowly dissolving into the human bodies. Now it was their turn to start violently twitching. It was quite the terrifying sight, and all the while the abomination watched. Soon, the humans had their skin turn gray and their irises disappear until all that was left was an empty white. It should also be mentioned that all the life in their bodies was gone. They were dead. It would seem that whatever experiment that the abomination was trying had failed. Well, it should have failed, but the humans had actually managed to stand up once again. Empty gaze, amateurish movements, and all but did it. From each of the humans, the same essence was being emitted. It was the same peculiar essence that the abomination had before it started assimilating with all sorts of beings, turning it into the monstrosity that it was now. It was undead essence. The essence of life when it was severely corrupted but not destroyed by death essence. This was a type of essence that struck fear in the heart of many because of how difficult it was to deal with. But this of course didn't faze the abomination. In fact, it even summoned multiple mouths just to grin. The audacity. The following year was a nightmare for all life forms on the North Continent. Undead beings ran everywhere, taking lives or converting others into more undead. The difference between the undead that the abomination created and the undead formed from excess exposure to undead essence isn't to be ignored. Don't let it fly over your head. Everyday lives were taken and the toll only increased. Even the mighty trees, which were all magic trees, were destroyed and consumed. In the end only the 3 overlords of the continent were left. The stone-armored bull king, that was in the 7th stage of the seeking beast realm and 1st stage in anatomy refinement. The lightning rock, that was in the 9th stage of the seeking beast realm. And finally the 3-tailed glacial fox, that was also in the 9th stage of the seeking beast realm. All of these terrifying beasts released their powerful auras as they prepared to go all out with the terrifying existence known as the abomination of the North. But before they could even react, 3 claws from 3 different species burst out of the slime abomination and grabbed them, dragging them back to the main body before disappearing. Fuck. The abomination wiggled in glee when it felt the succulent powers and abilities that it had absorbed. Now, it could move on to the next phase of its plans. The same rock wings that it had just obtained extend out of its body in a size that was proportionate to his own. Whoosh! With a flap of its wings, it disappeared into the air before shortly arriving at the shore of the sea. Now, what does the dash? Ding! System announcement. All residents have received the Eridel system as a gift from the gods. The Eridel system has been designed to help you in your everyday life. Please check status. What? Before the abomination could even react, a divine light exploded out of the sky. It wasn't even able to think before it was struck and darkness consumed its vision. The abomination. The terror of the continent had been knocked out in a single blow. A3. What a mess. A powerful and archaic yet seductive voice resounded throughout the North Continent. Eridel watched as the abomination slumped over, or more like semi-melted. Golden chains materialized from his primordial essence wrapped and around its body, with some of them puncturing through the slime. The chains served the effect of restricting the abomination's cultivation completely and made sure it could do no further harm. Although what it did to the North Continent was a little aggravating, it was a small price to pay. Such a wonderful existence like this, how could Eridel have the heart to destroy it? That being said, it would be a waste to just store it away. No, this abomination wasn't going to be a trophy, it had another thing coming. He had big plans for this thing. But on a side note, a part of him couldn't help but be more intrigued than he should in the fact that he couldn't predict what the abomination would do. As the creator of most if not all the residents in his world, as long as he was looking at them he could read them like a book. Nothing they could do would surprise him if he was consciously looking. Multiple schemes flashed through his head before his attention was dragged back to his planet. He had to say he was impressed, very impressed with the way things had progressed. Many notable key figures that he had kept his eye on were now thriving more than he ever thought they could. For example, the Crystal Dragon King, Azura, Honorable Brother, Draco, Nine Flame Queen and more. Having already looked through the World Archive, Eridel had not missed out on a single event during his seclusion. He had witnessed the amazing evolution of the Crystal Dragon King, the mutation of Draco and the Honorable Brother and the assimilation that the Nine Flame Queen went through with the peacock. That was for sure one of the more surprising ones. In fact, the whole situation of the South Continent went way above his expectations. Eridel's prediction was that the elementals would dominate the monsters, with the final face-off being between the Nine Flame Queen and the Wraith King. In the end, the Nine Flame Queen was meant to assimilate with the Wraith King, obtaining the Flames of Death, and even more incomprehensible and untouchable body. She would then become the Demon Empress and a monumental figure set in place to spread terror across the world until she was defeated. The world would learn a valuable lesson after that. But obviously, what Eridel envisioned hadn't come to fruition, but it was fine like this too. The legendary bird that the Nine Flame Queen had become resembled the vermilion bird from the myths of his homeworld. Such a fusion between monster and beast was unprecedented and would definitely be something worth replacing his original plot, but she probably wouldn't be some kind of world villain anymore. This was all the result of the existence of a single entity. Emperor Azura. A monster in more ways than one, even Eridel was flabbergasted at the series of events that allowed Azura to become the absolute behemoth that he was today. He would definitely become a valuable asset in the long run. Eridel marveled over the progress that his world had made in the 127 years that he was gone. All in all, almost everything was perfect. Almost. Naturally, there were bad situations too. By now, Eridel had expected there to be 4 emperors of the sea. He had actually left the sea alone and there was no one there that had been given a gift of any kind. He wanted to know what would happen to the seas if he didn't influence it in the slightest. The result was disappointing. Don't be confused, the average strength of those in the seas was above that of the dwellers of the lands, but why are they so goddamn treacherous? People say that foxes are trickery, wolves are cunning and humans are devious. But clearly they've never seen fish with substantial intelligence. There had been rulers in the seas before, but each and every time, they were betrayed, killed and eaten. It was like they were all possessed by envy, greed and gluttony. They were never content, they liked to steal and they were very, very ravenous. Instead of fearing and reverencing their betters, they schemed against them in hopes of taking their position. Not becoming like them, not surpassing them, but taking from them. In Eridel's eyes they were even more demon-like than the monster races. It was honestly disappointing. However, Eridel could acknowledge that they had their reasons. It started with the vast emptiness of the sea. When the marine life had entered cultivation they naturally gained superior intelligence. This prompted them into being more curious in things other than eating just to survive. But unfortunately for them, in the depths of the sea there was nothing to see. Everything was dark, bleak, silent and desolate. It was especially daunting on these life forms who had been affected by the special magical energy in Eridel's world. As a result of the strange magical energy that had a strange connection with soul essence, all life on Eridel's planet had much more receptive and sensitive souls. And not only that, each soul was also influenced by Eridel's soul and it was very slightly hive-mind in nature. That was the biggest reason that some of the words and terms used in Eridel's world were very familiar. This didn't sit well with the dwellers of the sea. Despite being born in this place, it felt very unnatural. The lack of light, the silence, the emptiness. All of these things that would cause Eridel agitation because of his 2,000 years of isolation, were causing these sea dwellers to feel hate, but they didn't even know why. An unjustified hate that constantly gnawed at their minds with no other target than their peers. Things became ugly. The other reason for the viciousness of the sea was because of the severe dog-eat-dog or rather fish-eat-fish rules that they had. There was nothing like politics or weapons that they could carry to ward off invaders. All that preserved their lives in the seas was their own personal strength. So strength they must gain, by any means necessary. At the very least, they will be excellent resources for my next plan. Eridel lamented over the fate of sea beasts before thinking about the gains. Eridel was a millennial-old monster. When you get to that age, instincts and emotions barely have any sway left that could affect your actions. Eridel was not going to take into consideration the emotions of his residents if there were long-term gains to be made. And in these seas, Eridel found a valuable resource: emotions. Envy, greed and gluttony. All of these emotions were boiling hot in the seas, and Eridel was not going to waste it. Eridel made a few mental notes and calculations before returning his attention to the world, more specifically, the second brightest star on the planet, Emperor Azura. As soon as Eridel had returned from his seclusion, he had lifted the restriction that was preventing his residents from breaking through into the fourth realm. Now, all those that were eligible for the breakthrough were undergoing shocking transformations at the same time. The fourth realm was very interesting, but as a matter of fact the number 3 was even more interesting. For some reason, there was a qualitative upgrade that a cultivator experienced after surpassing 3 levels. This was called the Rule of 3 upgrade. Whether it was an entire realm or just a stage, if you passed 3 of them, the strength you would gain would be much more extensive than what you gained in previous breakthroughs. Furthermore, not only did these Rule of 3 upgrades increase your strength, but they actually allowed you to unlock the hidden or restricted potential in your body. For example, it was possible to undergo a bloodline or constitution evolution when experiencing a Rule of 3 upgrade. Of course, such great benefits were not given for free. The universe did not and would never work like that. In truth, the amount of essence needed to break through on a Rule of 3 upgrade was enormous, and that was just for stages. Trying to achieve a Rule of 3 upgrade for a realm was, simply put, depressing. This was why you would see people that were forever limited at the 3rd, 6th or 9th realm if they didn't have what it takes to surpass it. Obviously, the first realm Rule of 3 upgrade was the breakthrough to the 4th realm. This was the breakthrough that a few of Eridel's residents were currently undergoing. But something very, very strange was going on. Normally, a bloodline evolution or even a constitution evolution should have been the most dazzling thing that could have happened to a cultivator, and even people in a law world would be extremely satisfied with such a thing. However, what was that? It is time. Eridel mentally grinned with glee. A little back in time, Emperor Azura was looking at the strange clouds that were ominously swirling above him. He couldn't for the life of him understand what the hell was going on. One moment, he could feel the frustrating insurmountable barrier that was preventing him from breaking through to the 4th realm abruptly disappear. This had surprised him so much that he had leapt to his feet in astonishment. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, he sent the killing essence in his body to the barrier of the 4th realm without thinking. Before he knew it, an enormous cloud that went on for thousands of meters was formed in the sky above his head. On top of that, the cloud was such a pure white color that if compared to snow, the snow would look like ash. It was the most ethereal cloud that Azura had ever seen. But he did not for a single second think it was innocent, because for some reason, the cloud was instilling such a profound primal fear in him that he wondered if his next breath would be his last. He could only watch with terror as the space at the center of the cloud was suddenly cleared with what looked like a magic circle occupying its space. Of course, Azura couldn't comprehend the strange symbols. The magic circle was gold in color and glowed with a peerless light that only grew brighter as the aura of solemnity and danger rose in correspondence. Once the magic circle seemingly reached its peak, Azura gained a sudden understanding of what was happening to him now. The heavens were giving him a tribulation, a test so to speak. A tribulation was an event that truly barred the way to the 4th realm. He would have to defend against 3 attacks, and if he wasn't worthy, his life was forfeit, simple as that. Each tribulation was based on the receiver's entire strength along with a few other taboo factors that he had no privy to, but at the very least, he understood what he must do and prepared to unleash the full might of all of his armaments, which also included the heavenly demon mountain. Something that he was actually able to establish a connection with when he had killed Chrysos. He couldn't achieve the same effect with the armaments from the dead demon kings, so he could only suspect that it was because Chrysos and he were essentially brothers, and the same blood that was used to make a connection with the mountain also flowed in him. But who knows? He pushed aside idle thoughts as he shoved all of his focus onto the strange tribulation weapon. Now was the time to fight for his very life. Sire! Azura roared to the heavens as he bared all 4 armaments, with the heavenly demon mountain looming behind him, supplying him with dense earth-killing essence. The magic circle within the cloud pulsed as if in acknowledgement. Boom! A golden divine light that looked like its sole purpose was to punish all evildoers slammed right into his body. Carghh! Azura screamed out as blood burst out of the holes that were torn open all over his body, and it was so harrowing that the thought of just letting death claim him flicked to life in his head. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Pain racked him to the depths of his soul, but he wouldn't give up. He had come too far to just let things be, and he hadn't even gotten revenge on the Wraith King yet. System announcement. All residents have received the Iridius system as a gift from the gods. The Iridius system has been designed to help you in your everyday life. Please check status. HM? Azura was shocked by the strange sounds that had been spoken from inside his own head. No, not sounds, words. What was that? And why did he know what most of those words were? The only word that confused him was gods. He knew what Iridius meant, for some reason he knew that word Iridius was the name. What is that? Either way, he somehow knew that the name of this very world was Iridius. But what was a world? I advise that the host focuses on his tribulation. There are 2 more tribulation lights to absorb. All of your questions can be answered afterwards. Absorb? Absorb? My thoughts? What are these? Boom. A tribulation light that was even stronger than the first smote his body once more, ravishing his insides and charring his flesh till it turned black. Kuhk. Azura couldn't even scream out properly as he spat out blood with his knees collapsing and his eyes rolling up. It had appeared that he had lost consciousness. But once again, he failed to detect the strange essence that wreaked havoc on the inside of his body, causing grand but hidden changes. Smoke billowed out of the horrendously burnt emperor, showing how extensive the damage done to his body was. Even 5 minutes later he was still on his knees with his eyes rolled all the way up. It was quite terrifying to think of how the behemoth-like body of the now 5-meter-tall Emperor Azura, lord of all monsters, was reduced to such a terrifying state. If even he could barely retain his life after the second strike, how could others survive the same ordeal? It was quite clear by now that this was a feature that Eridel had added to the Rule of 3 upgrade that all life forms eventually face, but why? Was Eridel trying to destroy the fate of all of his residents? Khk. Ku. Azura suddenly spat out a glob of saliva mixed with blood before descending into a coughing fit. The Emperor had woken up. Azura could not believe the reality that was presented before him. Just the second strike was enough to reduce him to such a state. Granted, he wasn't able to properly defend in time, but still, there was absolutely no way that he would survive the next strike. He would die. This tribulation was impossible. But how could this be? The information granted to him let him know that as long as he was strong in spirit and dauntless before the tribulation lights, he should prevail. No matter how powerful a tribulation, it was always tailored for the receiver. So why? Azura was so disheveled that he failed to realize that he was actually speaking in an actual language. Since the host has resisted fate, fate must take its payment. The abnormal voice once again resounded in his head saying incomprehensible things, but this time it didn't bother him. What was bothering him was the tribulation light that had once again recharged to its maximum capacity. He was finished. Azura watched with despair as the golden magic circle pulsed with a sacred light. Every cell in his body was screaming with pain and fear. Azura was very sure he had met his end. There was a limit to how much perseverance can take you, and Azura was pretty sure he was bankrupt. Just as he was preparing to accept his fatality, the female voice spoke out once more. The system recommends that the host sacrifices the heavenly demon mountain. Azura felt like he had heard the most sanctified voice in all existence. If this voice that had been pestering him all this while was telling the truth, he should be able to survive at the expense of the heavenly demon mountain. He had no qualms about sacrificing the last relic of Chrysos, but numerous dealings with the blood fiends had taught him of the difference between truth, lies and deceit. He wasn't so foolish as to believe that the actions and intentions of other people would always be the same. Not anymore. But he didn't have any other choice, and the tribulation was about to strike. Aerg! Azura exerted the last of his strength to move the mountain above his head at its largest size. The heavenly demon mountain shone with a profound grey aura as the earth-killing essence erupted to its full potential. And for a moment, Azura felt that the mountain had changed. Unfortunately, he didn't have a single brain cell that wasn't occupied, so investigating was impossible. Here and now, his life in its entirety was being judged. He had used his own strength to crawl to where he was now and had never looked back. He had crossed the corpses of his enemies time and time again, and the skies above knew that he did not slow. He had watched as his brothers and sisters had fallen one by one, and even then, he still never stopped. He had shed so much blood, sweat and tears to reach this pinnacle. And yet, some ridiculous faceless entity still dared to test him? Azura gritted his teeth with rage and exertion. I am not content. Arg. Azura raised all of his armaments above his head as he formed a shield of essence around himself. He refused to die. Boom. Korea. Azura shrieked with pain as the last tribulation light that was actually white in color instead of the usual gold struck straight through all of his defenses and straight to his very soul. Darkness consumed his vision as his consciousness fled without resistance. Wow. Eridel watched as the Lord of all monsters passed out in a heap, his body in terrible condition but still alive. He was impressed. He had been watching roughly the same process repeat itself all over the world, but Emperor Azura's tribulation was by far one of the most impressive. The guy even received a soul tribulation. How scary. Of course, Eridel was referring to the potential of the Emperor Azura rather than the so-called soul tribulation. How could he call something that he created himself scary? Indeed. The whole concept of the rule of 3 tribulation and the tribulation lights was created by Eridel himself. There was no such thing as a tribulation in other worlds. Eridel was not a bully. Correction, Eridel was not a bully to his own residents. He didn't create a tribulation because it was fancy and certainly not because he was scared of them causing some kind of uprising. Nay, it was much deeper than that. In the wide universe there existed a law that was always overlooked but caused one of the highest death rates out of all the laws. This was the law of fortune. When fortune looked upon you with grace, you were destined for success. When fortune looked upon you with disdain, you were destined for doom. Obviously, a lot of people knew that but rarely did anyone truly believe it. But it was true and Eridel knew it. He also had a small understanding of the mechanisms of the law of fortune and its ties with the law of fate. This enabled him to see the dark path that all the champions of his world would have had if he didn't put a stop to it. What many people didn't know was that every time a life form twisted its fate and overcame its life-changing obstacles, their fortune was used up. Every time they survived their calamities that normally would have killed them, they stole from fate. Of course, there were many ways for fortune to go up and down, but that didn't take away from the fact that all heroes eventually faced a miserable ruination. There was a reason why the quote, "die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain" existed. The people thought that it was just a funny phrase but, little did they know. Heroes don't just become villains for entertainment, they became villains because of the boundless sorrow that pushed them over the edge. Someone like Azura who was initially a lowly ogre but went on to become the lord of all monsters had unknowingly sold buckets of fortune in exchange for fate. But it was actually more accurate to say that he stole from fate and fate took away his fortune in retaliation. If things went as it is, Azura was finished. It was actually quite bad. Maybe his wife would be r**ped and his children devoured before his eyes after being betrayed by his own subordinates who then decided to burn his soul for 100 years whilst showing him the enslavement of his few remaining descendants. If Azura by some miracle, which by the way would steal more fate, managed to escape, how could his soul not be twisted beyond recognition? How could unlimited hatred not consume his thoughts? How could he not become the villain? That was how petty and savage fortune could be when it lost all of its favor for you. But fear not, for Eridel had already cracked the cheat code. This is where the tribulations come in. Eridel had set the tribulations in place as a means for fate to set in place a proper punishment for those who take from it. In exchange, it would give the fortune back and all would be well, if they survived. The white-colored soul tribulation that Azura had received at the end was a manifestation of the gallons of fate that he had absorbed and what he must properly pay for. But taking your fortune back was not all there was to the tribulations. Not in the slightest. Not only did the tribulations give you your fortune back, but the tribulation lights themselves actually benefited the body. They vaporized impurities and purified the mana, or other substitute, inside the body. They also altered the body to make it more perfect for cultivation, becoming more sensitive and receptive to essence of all kinds. Just the fact that the tribulations would give you back your fortune was enough to cause a ruckus in the law worlds. But now they can also help to grant you a body that's more perfect for cultivation too. Madness. Any yet. That was not all. Eridel watched as the bodies of the beasts and monsters that had entered the fourth realm began to change. Azura's body began to softly float as sudden wind currents gathered around him and the magic energy in the vicinity rose like a tsunami before flooding straight into his body. After 5 minutes of soaking up untold amounts of magic energy, Azura's 5-meter-tall body began to shrink as the wounds on his body began to simultaneously heal. After his body was reduced to 2 meters tall, his body started experiencing grand alterations. First, his second pair of arms receded into his body as if they were illusions. Next was the color of his skin. The color had changed into a very light gray that was much paler in comparison to his original skin color but still remained healthy looking. In fact, it actually looked slightly luminous. On top of that, the skin was very, very smooth. There were no imperfections or scars to hide its strangely alien beauty. After that was the change in his skeletal-muscular system. Azura's body seemed to have been refined. His muscles were shorter, less bulky and instead more streamlined. His body looked like it was directly configured for combat, making him look like an apex humanoid male. His face had changed, looking much more handsome and containing a devilish charm that would prove to be fatal to females of any humanoid species. Even his hair had changed, elongating until it reached the middle of his back and becoming more lustrous and voluminous as if he had never lived in the wild for nearly 130 years. Last but not least were the extra pair of horns that had appeared on each side of his forehead. Now, Azura had a total of 4 black, jagged horns that pierced towards the sky, with the original ones on the sides of his head being more curled. Azura had become a greater demon. The 4th realm that all monsters must reach or die trying. Azura's body gracefully floated back to the ground with one foot stepping first as his eyes slowly opened, portraying the elegance of a greater demon that his previous form completely lacked. Well then. This is interesting. Come out, Babunda, let me see your face. Russell. They have achieved communication, they all have achieved communication. Eridel thought impassively as he turned his attention to the other magisterial transformations that took place all over the world. This was actually the result of the common language that Eridel had installed into the system. A language that all enlightened species could speak and a language that all beasts and monsters at the 4th realm gained. This was bound to cause temporary confusion, but there was no other way. The system spoke directly into the mind, and when the status and other such things were in view, there were words to be read. Thoughts of intent wouldn't cut it. Oh? Eridel's attention was attracted to another phenomenon that occurred in the southern desert of the central continent. In the boundless lands filled with sand and dunes stood the biggest life form that the planet had ever seen since the dawn of its birth. And it was still in the middle of growing. The beast was actually an elephant, one that had been there since from the beginning, meaning it was approximately 127 years old, which by itself was already an achievement for a prey beast like that. Prey beasts tended to die a lot, go figure. It was an even bigger achievement for a herbivore to actually reach the zenith of the 3rd realm, which allowed it to experience the rule of 3 tribulation and the corresponding transformation. But something was different. Instead of decreasing in size before taking a humanoid shape, it was actually increasing in size at a colossal rate. A celestial beast. How wonderful. Eridel knew what was going on and he was alight with glee. How long had he walked these sands? He did not know. Since the time he first drew breath, he was privileged to have seen all kinds of things. Some he wished would fade away from the depths of his memory, and some that desperately wished would forever exist within his soul. His family. Oh, his precious family. Why did they have to die? But he knew the answer. In the everlasting cycle of life and death there would always be those that are predators and those that are prey. Those that take lives to better their own and those that remained passive until life seeped out of their veins and abandoned them. Unfortunately, he and his family were prey, and such things tended to die a lot. He had even seen the fall of his mightier and hairier cousins, and he would never forget the despair of that time, the time that he had thought he had found peace in the protection of the mammoths, only for it to be snatched. But despite all the times that death had brushed his soul, life had yet to abandon him, and he continued to draw breath. And now, he had once again come close to death. 3 golden strikes from the sky that seemed to beseech for his destruction. Were the clouds above predators too? It matters not. He had survived once again, and it wasn't even the worst of his experiences. He still remembered another time when his flesh and skin were lacerated from his bones, blood soaked the earth beneath him, with the screeching of abominable beasts resounded in his soul even now. He was so very tired. But once again he had been given a boon for his troubles. The other time, it had been a whole body upgrade that had made him extremely tough and quite handsome, if he must say so himself. This time, he had been given 2 choices to choose from. Congratulations, host. You have met the requirements for the celestial beast and now have 2 evolutions to pick from. Enlightened beast, gain a humanoid transformation with the ability to absorb essence and utilize runes. Celestial beast, unfortunately, the host is unqualified for this information. The host has 10 seconds to choose before a forced evolution as an enlightened beast. What? It was that voice again that had been somewhat helpful when he was being attacked by the sky, but now it was talking nonsense. He didn't quite understand, but he met the requirements for the evolution but not the requirements for its information. Well, going by the series of events, the celestial beast should be more impressive? Does the host wish to evolve into a celestial beast? Yes? Congratulations. Oh? Why think YHNNGH? All thoughts fled as pain racked him to the depths of his soul. Never in his entire life had he suffered such an utter devastation like this, and it was actually increasing. He tried and failed to scream. Even sight and sound had fled him at this point, and all he could feel was a soul-dissipating agony. More senses soon began failing him. Taste, touch. When was it that he stopped feeling his body? And why oh why did pain still sing the loudest? In fact, how much time had he spent in this state? It was beginning to feel like he had already spent a whole lifetime, but maybe it was more? Just as his mind was beginning to disintegrate, the pain abruptly vanished and his senses were shoved back into him. Not that he could make use of them, he was terribly disorientated. But, once again, I have survived. Congratulations, host. You have been gifted with the following name, Apis. Apis' 500-meter-tall body crumpled to the ground with a boom before he passed out. Absolutely wonderful. I didn't expect to see a celestial beast so soon. Eridel looked upon the Apis' behemoth-like body that was definitely the biggest one on the planet. The skin of the elephant was a stone gray that looked as ancient and majestic as the world itself instead of the mere 127 years that it has spent in existence. They contained strange but exquisite markings of a darker color that attracted the eye, but Eridel knew that if any mortal even attempted to comprehend them it would cause them immense pain. The elephant wore thick ankle bands made from gold that were adorned with different jewels, and they were certainly not there before. Obviously, they were a result of the evolution. Looking at the way they pulsed with a faint light each time Apis took a breath, one would wonder if the jewelry were actually organic. On top of that, there were 2 gigantic dangling earrings attached to each ear that carried a strange aura of intimidation and unstoppable might. They were definitely not normal. Neither were the tusks that jutted out of the elephant's face. They were completely gold and radiated a terrifying aura that threatened to slice you apart just by looking at it. And last but certainly not least was the tremendous size that the beast had reached. A whole whopping 500+ meters tall. A celestial beast. A beast that had met specific and yet ambiguous requirements in order to unlock the evolution. A celestial beast didn't obtain a human form nor the ability to absorb essence freely from the air. However, they obtained the most tyrannical and divine bodies possible that allowed them to be multiple times stronger than other beasts of the same level. In fact, some of the more talented celestial beasts would be able to fight other beasts that were a whole realm above them. E.G. Realm 4 Stage 5 Celestial Beast fighting against a Realm 5 Stage 5 regular beast. It got even more stupendous when such celestial beasts were Law's beasts at the same time. But that was for another time. Right now, Eridel had much more pressing issues. Somewhat unexpected, but at the same time it was to be expected. Humanity was failing. In a regular world, there shouldn't be a situation where an enlightened race was at the bottom of the food chain, but here it was. Ants and rats were casually bullying humans, lower mid-level life forms like wolves were enforcing humans as servants, and higher-level life forms like the dragons and snakes were straight up enslaving them or using them as cattle. A disgrace. As an ex-human and current elite planetary engineer, Eridel could not let such an imbalance persist. Eridel zoomed his attention to the North Continent and a group of human teenagers that were running frantically through a forest. The picture of desperation and despair could be found on each of their faces. Clearly something was chasing them. And alas, the sound of a rustling bush was heard and an indistinguishable shadow appeared with a shocking speed that the children were unprepared for. The shadow latched onto one of the younger children that was lagging behind and promptly bit down on his nape as the child screamed with terror. No, screamed one of the girls that was running in the front. She faltered in her running as she watched as her 12-year-old brother was devoured. Unfortunately for her, she was already lacking in energy, and screaming out loud and splitting her attention like that wasn't really conducive to escaping. The girl tripped and didn't have the energy to right herself, and she wasn't even sure if she was willing. That was her brother right there, the one she promised to protect till her death, so was there even a point in escaping anymore? She briefly caught the image of the despair in her brother's eyes as more of those strange creatures appeared and surrounded him. Dismay gripped her heart before the disorientation of falling scattered the image. The girl collapsed to the ground, but she didn't even have the time to blink before her arm was grabbed and she was dragged in the same direction that she had been running again. A boy had actually grabbed the girl and continued running. He had seen the situation and had seen the little boy die, but there was nothing he could do about that. He could however save the boy's sister, so that was what he would do. Though, now they were both in danger and he didn't know how they could possibly survive. He forcefully dragged the girl in front of him, before straightening her posture and pushing her forward, all in one movement. It was such a beautiful maneuver that one would think that he had experience in pushing reluctant runners. The girl took one more glance at her brother before cringing in horror and turning back to run. A ferocious expression began to grow on her face and her running started to look more like stomping, as if she wanted to punish the ground for whatever sight she had just seen. The boy felt like sighing, but he was already huffing and puffing. At this point he was already familiar with this scenario and he had seen many of his people die. But this time it was worse. Some strange system had arrived and they were able to somehow communicate with each other using the strange sounds that the system itself had used. Words, that's what it was. Sometimes he forgot. But ever since then they had achieved a much closer relationship. Everyone including him had felt much more like family since they were able to share their experiences and it was so fun. Alas, they had forgotten the reality of their situation and the cannibals had found them and made them pay savagely in price. That little boy wasn't even the third death today. He shook his head from such depressing thoughts and continued running. He was good at that. If you wanted to live in this world you need to know how to run. His father had always taught him how to run even before the appearance of the cannibals. Too bad he was dead now. Besides the girl who was running a couple meters in front of him, there were 3 other people much further ahead. They were 2 boys and 1 girl and part of the new family they were forming. His heart warmed when the 3 in the front turned around and started making gestures for them to run faster. He took a quick glance back and was pleased with the distance they had made. The cannibals always took time to eat before resuming chase. They should be able to maw. CSSSSSHH. Huh? Neither the boy or girl could comprehend the image of their 3 companions suddenly becoming headless as their heads soared into the sky in a trail of blood. What was even more jarring was the fact the bodies still kept running for a few more seconds as blood was ejected in copious amounts. Soon, humanoid figures started appearing over the bodies, with some getting straight to business and some of them eyeing the boy and his last living friend. These humanoids actually looked exactly like humans, but neither of them was actually whole. They either had a large amount of flesh missing from their bodies or were complete skeletons. Some were more complete than others, but some you would never confuse for a living being. They were cannibals. But Eridel would prefer to call them lesser undead. The girl dropped to her knees with a look of horror as her companions were devoured whilst the boy completely stopped running. He didn't even bother to look at the scene and merely gazed at the ground with soulless eyes as his body passively tried to regather oxygen. The picture of defeat. Would you guys like some help? Everyone froze. The undead were incapable of speech and the only 2 people alive were currently indisposed. So who was it that was speaking in such a jovial tone? And what was it they said? They were offering help? The boy that had previously given up hope snapped his head to the place that the voice had come from, seeking for hope, seeking for anything that would save him and his final remaining friend. And he found. Wow. His brain actually stuttered like a glitch in a code and needed a moment to comprehend the ethereal image before him. A man? Nay, not a man. A man could not accomplish this. Although the figure was undoubtedly masculine, there was not a doubt in his heart that this being was above mortality and maybe even life itself. Far, far above humanity. The entity was roughly 7 foot tall with a musculature and visage that was so perfect that it was as if every curvature and every color tone was set in place for the sole purpose of intoxication. One look was not enough, one look would never be enough. And yet, the boy felt like he would die if he looked a second longer. A deep unrelenting wave of primordial fear assailed his senses, prompting him to flee and never look back. In fact, even the memory of the very scene that was playing out before him was threatening to evaporate. But even then, he was almost willing to risk the certain death that his instincts were warning him of for just one more look. Just one more look at the beyond. Almost. But reason prevailed and he looked to the ground before his very existence vanished. However, 2 things took place when he did so. First was the notion that he was being unbelievably silly. Just looking at someone shouldn't be as dangerous as the fate that his body was seemingly promising. He even wanted to take that so desperate look that he had just forsaken himself when the second fact hit him. He could not for the life of him remember a single detail other than 2 gloriously golden eyes. a gold whose beauty disgraced the sun, a grace so vast that it encompassed the world, and the effortless power to enthrall that was oh, so dangerous. And yet, how was it possible that he couldn't remember a single other thing? It was that thought that made him panic. His repeated desperate attempts for a memory that his mind was fighting to delete or at least seal was actually started to cause him damage. Blood spurted out of his nose and welled up in his eyes as his body started twitching. Only the feminine groan of pain and a quick glance enlightened him to the fact that his friend was suffering the same fate. Their bodies were rejecting anything that had to do with the entity, including memory, and he was completely terrified. Relax. A sonorous voice that was filled with honey and power sounded out, swimming through the air and caressing the ears of those who had the capability to hear. He didn't realize it before in the heat or rather diminishing heat of the situation, but that voice was not normal. The boy absolutely refused to believe that the sounds that he could make and the sounds that the entity were making originated from the same plane of existence. And with the lack of memory he couldn't even confirm that the sound that was literally touching him had come from a human's mouth even if they were human words. What kind of human spoken words that felt like the warm hug of his father? This entity was absolutely not within his ability to understand and most certainly had the power to make him vanish like his instincts had been badgering him about. And yet, just that one word was enough to make his apprehensions and qualms dissipate. I'm finished. A small remaining part of him managed to think the thought before that too was scattered into nothingness. A smile of adoration and comfort crept onto his face. Well fuck. Eridel's right eye twitched as he fought to keep the frustration off his face. It had been so long since he had fitted the body of a humanoid or any kind for that matter, and the lack of practice assaulted his patience. Indeed, the entity that was causing the minds of those around him to go through such pandemonium was the humanoid manifestation of Eridel himself, but at the same time not quite. The body had most of the functions that an enlightened species should contain and obviously a bit more, but it was a sham. The body was not a life form at all. It was like an elusive amalgamation of laws that formed together to give the image of a body. The only thing that made it more than what it was the piece of Eridel's soul that it had been forcefully fused with. This allowed Eridel to completely embody the manifestation and gain the full body experience, but even then, his situation was a lot more volatile than what he would wish for. On a happier note, the body he made was pretty handsome if he had to say so himself. It couldn't be helped, his pride as an entire planet and phenomenal existence with the power to wield all laws would never allow him to make anything less than exemplary for his manifestation on the planet. The body was roughly 7 foot tall with long flowing white hair, golden eyes reminiscent of his primordial essence and pure white robes that slowly undulated with an unseen force. In reality, a true manifestation or whatever it was called required him to do a pseudo-reincarnation on a part of his soul into a soulless embryo. That would truly make the body he gained organic and less than likely to break apart along with that part of his soul. For now, this current form would do. Or so he thought. Even if he wasn't rusty when it came to using the body, he was a complete novice when it came to wielding this amount of power, and it was causing serious effects to the environment. Talk less of its less than visible effects on reality, just its effects on the 2 children before him were causing him a headache. Eridel sighed before pushing aside all distracting thoughts. It was better to get this over with before the 2 kids in front of him had a mental breakdown for real. The boy was 16 whilst the girl was 14. No need to guess when he could see it like a splotch of red paint on a blank sheet of paper. As for their appearance, they are ugly. There was no the more you look at them the better the look, nay, they were simply unattractive, dirty too. Even if they had entered the body refinement realm 1, by virtue of the essence-filled food they had eaten and had become cultivators, who were all supposed to be beautiful and handsome, they were quite unsightly. There was no other way around it. Humans did not even have a history of 200 years and they simply had no need for beauty in this era. Back on Eridel's home planet, beauty was used as a trait that the weaker females used to attract mates, and that was after the amount of bloodbaths were diminished and humans actually had the time to start admiring and acknowledging the concept of beauty. It probably started with the sun followed by nature and whatnot. When beauty within female humans became a thing and the ugly ones were neglected and left to die out, it was much more needed for them to go through a genetic change. Only much later did men need to care about beauty within themselves. Just being strong used to be all that was needed to attract mates, and that to some extent still persists till this day, since instincts that last thousands of years don't just delete themselves. However, The mind is a powerful thing, and if generations of females were going to be taught from young that their ideal mate was the Prince Charming, or at the very least a gentleman who would treat them with delicate care, that was what they would seek. Being powerful was no longer enough, and men now needed sophistication, charisma, and to some degree, good looks. One of the three at least. In the Iridius world there was no such thing as a weaker gender. In fact, female lions also had manes, even if they were quite different, that enabled them to attract mates just the same way the males did, and that was just one of the slight differences between the Iridius world and others. The only thing you needed in this world was power. You want a harem? Power's your key. You want resources? Power is your employer. You want to be a ruler? Power is your backer. Power, power, power. There was no need for beauty. Humans were unlike the elves that Eridel had forcefully encoded beauty upon, or even the high humans whose beauty was founded by the queen herself. However, there will be a day that the humans will encounter these beautiful people, and it will be interesting to see what happens. Going back to the two humans in front of Eridel, they were indeed cultivators of the body refinement realm, meaning that they had good bodies, symmetrical faces and clear skin. Barely any of that skin could be seen thanks to the clumps of dirt and waste that clung to them, so it need not be said that there was no concept of hygiene. And even if they had symmetrical features, the features were terribly bland and completely unflattering. But for the sake of things, the boy had brown hair and black eyes, with the girl having black hair and the same black eyes. To top that off, her hair was just as short as the boy's, which meant that it stopped by her ears. After all, what was the need for long hair? Beauty? Ha! It gets in the way of fighting, and no need. They didn't even need to cut it, they just didn't have a single chromosome that thought long hair was useful. In reality they weren't actually ugly, not in the truest sense. Cultivators can never have odd features that constitute being ugly, so they weren't ugly. But if you look at people like Azura, Reiko, Draco, and all those other beastly studs in their humanoid forms, not to mention the even more peerlessly attractive elven and high human queens, these two kids were woefully ugly in comparison. Whatever the case, they were both smiling towards the ground, like the fact that the undead were literally vibrating with terror, with some of them even passing out right beside them, didn't mean anything. Clearly, Eridel's simple message to tell the relax was doing a lot more than making sound. To be honest, it wasn't intentional. None of their reactions were intentional. The fear came as a result of his quality of being, not even his aura, because that was thankfully not leaking. Eridel feared that they would simply drop dead if it did. But anyways, a quality of being could be summarized as the quality or rank of someone's existence, kind of like the difference between a dragon and a mouse. Even if they were in the same cultivation realm and stage, they were still worlds apart. Someone with a high quality of being often had the effect of making weaker beings unable to resist or even think of a single thought beyond fear. Now that you know that, it was obvious that Eridel's quality of being was very, very high. As for his voice that had forcefully calmed the two children, that was something that Eridel had ever since he became a world. Each time he became stronger, the voice became more attractive and more powerful. Deceive, seduce, or manipulate, he could do it with a single sound. Even if it was unfair to others and he didn't even plan for it, he wasn't one to throw away power even if he could. Was he, a 2,000-year-old being, supposed to care about the ethics of others? Nay. Fear or revere him, it matters not. Now, for these little chosen ones, heroes chosen by the world itself to save the continent from the oh-so-scary undead, what powers shall I give them? A condescending grin etched itself on his face as millions of thoughts flickered through his mind. My name is Jonas. Eridel's voice billowed out like a pleasurable mist that coursed through the bodies of those that heard. The two humans shivered from the feeling as elation and peace grew in their hearts. They were still looking at the ground, not daring to look up. But they were extremely comfortable and felt utterly satisfied. So long as they heard this voice, they yearned for nothing. Thud. Another undead collapsed. Footsteps were heard before the end of cloth entered their vision, not that they knew what it was. In fact, they were thinking that it must have been part of his actual body, like fur to a wolf. They had seen many strange creatures, and it could be said that their minds were broad. Come, let me show you something. A hand on their shoulders and everything in sight disappeared before a different scenery appeared. A small cloud beneath their feet and boundless lands just below. They had been teleported? Shock flashed on their faces as they looked at each other. They were seriously out of their element now, and things were appearing like a dream. How had they appeared up in the clouds? Back on Eridel's home planet, any human in this position would have asked the additional question, how were they standing on clouds? But here in the Iridius world there was no science that said that clouds were condensed water vapor and therefore intangible, so of course, why should they question its solidity? Why should clouds fail to serve as a platform? The boy looked in awe at the other bigger clouds slightly higher up in the sky whilst the girl looked below, marveling at the vastness of the world. Look closer, look at what has become of your continent. It was the ethereal voice of Jonas that broke them out of their amazement, remembering that there was another being with them that was many times more interesting. It couldn't be helped, their body and soul simply refused anything to do with something so dangerous and kept trying to delete the memory. But the words were spoken and they were impossible to disobey, not that they had the intention. Both of them looked more closely at the grand expanse of land below them as they briefly mulled over the word continent when a surprising definition from the system resounded in their heads. A continent is a continuous expanse of land that contain many kinds of life forms just like the one below you. In this world there are currently 5 continents. The girl could never get quite used to the system's strange voice that was only ever heard in her head, but she appreciated its help. It was then that they noticed something odd. What is that? The girl muttered as horror began to creep in her heart. The boy also stumbled with fear as his eyes discovered the source of his friend's distress. Eridel watched them patiently as he mentally patted himself on the back. They're actually a lot calmer than I thought they would be despite the series of events of the past 10 minutes. It must be because of my divine presence indeed, I am just simply too they have forgotten me again. Eridel wasn't actually surprised, everything apart from his lack of control and the increasing effects of his voice had been within his expectations. So much so that he was beginning to feel bored and decided to entertain himself with hubris. But what a blow to his heart it was each time they treated him like air. He turned his golden eyes to the ravaged continent below. Unlike other continents, what used to be green was now mostly gray. Tormented by the reign of the abomination, the continent had fallen to a state where the essence of undeath had soaked deep and that was not quite healthy for any kind of life. This was most noticeably shown by the effect on the trees. The status of trees went something like 70% dead and wasted, 20% barely living and 10% undead. Indeed, when the essence of undeath had infiltrated the trees, there were a few special ones that had actually managed to adapt to the essence and even use it to evolve. These special trees had actually broken through to the spirit tree stage and developed souls, something that should have taken 873 more years. On top of that, their souls were actually stronger than what a normal spirit tree's soul should have been, and that was even after taking the special soul-flavored magical energy of this world into consideration. Unfortunately, these trees had developed a new craving for the taste of life and would attack anything containing it. The residents in the surroundings had learned that lesson quite firmly and they would never forget it. The wood of these trees were black in color whilst the leaves were gray. The branches of these trees were viciously crooked and finally, the total height of the trees ranged from 70 to 110 meters tall. These were the undead trees, or as the few remaining residents on the continent liked to call them, trees of death. However, there was something much more special at the center of these trees and even Eridel was impressed. But the 2 humans were not so welcoming. In the west was where the trees of death were mainly concentrated, and when you saw the 300-meter-tall tree of death at the very heart of it, it didn't take much to guess why. This tree was obviously much different to the other trees of death, and it was more than just height. The wood was gray in color, the exact same shade as the essence of undeath, and the leaves were actually a pure white. They even had a slight glow to them and would surely look lovely in the night. But there were number 2 things that kept it from becoming a tourist spot or even an idol of worship. First, was the revolting aura of malevolence that radiated out of the tree. Not only did this tree have a high quality of being, but its cultivation that was surprisingly a 20th of the way to becoming a fate tree, which by the way should have taken a few thousand years, was not helping the tree stay low-key. Clearly, the tree has soaked up a lot of essence. Second was the fact that it was a tree of death. There would be no researchers holding hands and circling the trunk of the tree each year. How unfortunate. The 2 children shivered in fright as they looked at the baleful aura released by the giant tree of death. It was so oppressively invasive that thoughts of retreat began to propagate in their minds. Run! Escape! Flee! The many miles of distance between their location and the tree apparently meant nothing. Sweat seeped out of their pores as their skins paled. Chests heaved up and down with hyperventilation with darkness creeping into their vision. They were about to pass out. Be calm. And like the words of an angel, all of their fears and anxieties fled as peace was once more restored in their hearts. Eridel's voice blanketed them in an atmosphere of tranquility and invincibility. Nobody would be able to hurt them here. Quite the good trick. They quickly turned to the source of their growing obsessions only for their heads to be forcefully grabbed and made to bow. It would be bad if their minds started glitching again. There's only so much that their minds can take. Eridel thought, keeping his hands on their heads to prevent them from laying eyes on him. The boy gave a sigh of relief. He was only now remembering the time he had almost imploded from the sight of the mighty entity, and his repetitive failure in memory was beginning to annoy him. Why do I keep forgetting? He thought in frustration. However, the thought didn't last long and his attention was quickly absorbed by the entity before him. Look once more, Eridel whispered. And they did. This time with Eridel purposefully blocking the tree's presence. Look at the destruction that has been wrought upon your lands. Hundreds of thousands of your people have already perished and more continue to die. Eridel spread his arms out like the Christ the Redeemer statue. Can you see the claws of death that have grasped your fate? Your people are a doomed race. Eridel's words no longer invoked the enchanting waves of tranquility, but instead the bone-scraping wrath of animosity. An uncomfortable heat smothered them as rage painted itself on their faces. If nothing is done, humanity will go extinct and all the people you love will crumble away. Is this what you want? Eridel egged them further. And no. I don't want that to happen, I hate it. I hate them, the girl shrieked as she clenched her fists to the point that blood spilled. Eridel gave a small smile. Really? But what can you do? You are weak, Eridel whispered in her ear. I the girl was stumped with what to say when the boy interjected. Save us. Eridel wasn't surprised with the directness of their words. Human beings had yet to learn the art of discretion and had barely scraped on the concept of lying. But I cannot do that. Eridel's voice sounded like it was full of regret. It was as if it was his biggest shame that he couldn't personally help them. That was obviously a lie. But the effects of his voice were indeed marvelous. The whole atmosphere seemed to be dampened with sorrow. You would almost believe that rain would start pouring. However, and just like that the atmosphere shifted again. I can grant you the power to change your fate. The power to wrestle survival from extinction and the power to save your people with your own two hands. Boom! Lightning crackled against the sky with a shocking intensity. Being in such proximity with the sky caused fear to pulse within the two humans, but that was soon drowned by the reality of what the entity that loomed over their backs was presenting. Power? The power to save humanity by themselves? How? The boy's eyes widened with utter confusion and surprise. Like this. The two children felt a hand rest on their heads which caused them to jump, but they didn't even have time to think before waves and waves of unknown essences began to pour down into their bodies. Eewa! Shrieking like banshees as their heads snapped back to the sky with their eyes rolled back. It was to the point that their irises had disappeared and anyone looking at the scene would think they were experiencing the worst torture imaginable. However, the reality of the situation couldn't be further from the truth. As the essence that Eridel had shoved into them began to do their work, unprecedented changes began to take place all over their body. Everything down to their very DNA was affected and it quickly began to show. With the boy, his height steadily grew until he reached 6 feet, which was an impressive height for a 16-year-old in this era, and his skin developed a sun-kissed tan that carried a masculine air. His hair rapidly lengthened until it reached his shoulders and the color was a lustrous amber that wasn't unlike fire when it moved in the wind. His eyes were a lighter orange and they complemented his hair. On top of that, his musculature had drastically improved and was especially primed for mortal combat. On the other hand, the girl had reached a height of 5'8", gained clear white skin that was absent of any blemishes and a musculature that, whilst defined, did not lose a single drop of femininity. In fact, it could be said to have increased with the improvement of her figure, especially when you took in her new lavender-colored hair that reached her thighs and her crystal-like blue eyes. Gallons of impurities were released out of their bodies, but they quickly vaporized along with any remaining dirt on their bodies, leaving them clean and visible for Eridel to see. Both of them had experienced shocking transformations and were completely different to their previous forms. It was to the point that nobody would ever recognize them as the same person if they were to make a comparison. Clearly, the essence that had entered their bodies hadn't been normal in the slightest. And obviously, it didn't stop at just looks. The girl trembled as she felt abnormal strength coursing through her body. She had even forgotten about the pain that had been replaced with the soothing self-nourishing effects of her inner mana. All that she could focus on was the shocking power contained in her small body along with the inherited memories. As a matter of fact, she was still in the second stage of body refinement, but the difference in strength between her now and her before was like the difference between day and night. There was no comparison. She even felt like she had ascended to the heavens in a single step, and unrestrained ambitions began to soar through her heart. With this power I can definitely save all humans. After that, I will be the new chief? No, with all the humans under my rule, I can be the new queen or even empress. But what are these strange titles? She didn't actually know the difference between the three titles, but when she tried thinking of a word that was above chief, which was the word she got when thinking of the ruler of her small group before, she got the word queen and then empress afterwards. The common language translation was a magical thing, and it would indeed be confusing for the first year or so, but soon it would completely assimilate with the steadily growing society. Similar thoughts were also running through the boy's mind, and nothing was escaping Eridel's attention. Good, be ambitious. Take your strength and use it to set the path of humanity forwards. However, with this kind thought process, there's a good chance that they'll end up killing each other after completing what needs to be done. Personally, I don't care, but when I introduce my new update to the world, they'll probably be unable to stay far from each other, unable to even fathom the thought of the other being harmed. He. Eridel wasn't even going to inform them that their current power wasn't as much as they were thinking it was. The quick increase in power along with the sharp contrast made them think what they had was unfathomable, and the fact that they didn't know that Eridel was blocking the special Tree of Death's aura from them wasn't helping that. In reality, all they had was the power of a stage 6 body refiner. Extremely impressive for being at a mere stage 2, but not nearly enough for the powerhouses that were 3 whole realms above them. The two children drugily turned away from the tree to look at the almighty figure who had saved them from death and provided them with power to change their fate. They had no more problems remembering his existence now that Eridel had left a pseudo-imprint on their souls, but what was lost was forever lost to them, and they could only remember his remarkable eyes. Now they could finally see him in all his glory. And yet they were disappointed. All they could see was a strange orange stick with a pointy end and a much smaller stick that was black in color with a sharp golden tip. This smaller stick was also paired with a flat rock. All of them hovered over the cloud like magic, and it was more than a little strange. However, they had completely different identities to the two children. The boy knew that what they would have called a stick in the past was actually a spear. One of many weapons that he had gained the knowledge of in his inherited memories. The spear was 2 meters tall and looked like it was carved directly from an amber gemstone, meaning it carried the same transparency and was just as smooth. Faint rune inscriptions rested all over the weapon, including the brighter colored Christmas tree-shaped blade, but they were inactive. On the other hand, the girl recognized the small stick as a rune inscription pen and the flat rock as a grimoire. The rune inscription pen looked like an ink pen that was black in color with intricate golden patterns and a tip of the same color. It was 10 centimeters long. As for the grimoire, it was a rather nice-looking book that was 5 centimeters thick with a black cover made from leather. The same patterns that adorned the pen were also designed into the book around the edges. There was even a book lock with the actual lock part being made out of gold, and if you looked closely, an inscription shaped like a lion's head laid on the lock. Surprise and confusion was all over their faces before they came to the sudden conclusion that these were gifts from their benefactor. With glee practically shining from their skin, they rushed forward to grab their respective gifts. The boy grabbed the spear and the girl grabbed the pen and grimoire. They were so giddy that in the process of collecting their gifts, they came close to falling off the cloud. This, along with the fact that Eridel wasn't there to take them down, made them pale, killing the excitement out of their veins. This was not yet the time to celebrate. They paused to see if they would be teleported back, but seeing that nothing was happening, they were starting to get anxious. Would they be left there forever? Was their bright and colorful future a lie? Nay. The cloud soon started moving down, and it was clear that it was going to take them back itself. The boy sighed with relief before turning back to the girl, who noticed and looked back at him. What they saw left them shocked. What? How? This was actually the first time they had taken note of each other ever since they had gained their new powers, and they were flabbergasted by their changes in appearance. They both looked at each other with awe, and their minds were addled. Each of them considered the other the most aesthetically pleasing humans that they had ever seen, and it was causing them certain reactions. Especially in that of the boy. He was 16 years old already, and hormones had well and truly embedded itself within him. His reaction was quite visible to the girl, who looked on with an obvious curiosity. There was no such thing as sexual embarrassment for the humans that didn't even know what clothes were in this era. It's getting bigger, she thought. However, before anything could happen, a voice they would never forget resounded throughout the air. This is my last message to you children before I next see you. As of right now you are both terribly weak. Do not be conceited and challenge those above your capabilities, for if you die, humanity and the rest of the continent will follow you to hell. And it is to them that you will have to atone. Both of them paled but looked forward with a newfound determination. Be brave and do not give up. Fight and never look back. If you succeed, I will be awaiting you, my twin stars of hope. Gabriel and Sarakiel. May the gods be with you. The boy Gabriel and the girl Sarakiel felt a certain energy rush through their bodies when their names were called, letting them know who was who. It felt so comfortable that they nearly shivered, and yet tears began to slip out of their eyes. Above the lands a figure garbed in white robes floated in the sky. It was Eridel, and he was staring quite intently at a certain gray-colored cloud that stretched far and wide. Looking closely, a faint flickering of remnant lightning could be seen. What the fuck is that? Eridel thought back to his short conversation with the two children Gabriel and Sarakiel, but more accurately the effects of his voice. With intent, his voice was able to play with the emotions of those around him and even had extra effects that could cause pleasure or pain. However, the lightning that flashed through the air when he finished the sentence, the power to save your people with your own two hands, was absolutely not normal. If Eridel wanted, he could indeed achieve the same effect, but that would be him forcefully calling down lightning rather than his voice actually affecting nature itself. So at first, for a millisecond, Eridel thought it was a coincidence. And indeed it was. But when Eridel focused on the cloud that the lightning bolt had originated from, he realized that not only was the lightning bolt abnormal, but the cloud too wasn't. It appeared to be either. It was alive. He almost abandoned the twin stars of hope then and there when he found out, only managing to restrain himself until he passed on their inheritances before vanishing like smoke. And now here he was, eyeing the cloud just above him. What the fuck is that? He muttered, but as he said it, almost all there was to know about the cloud entered his brain as if he were reading a book. Unbelly no, actually. This is good, perfect. What a good system indeed, ha 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 ha. Eridel spread his arms out with joy as his body tilted until he was parallel with the ground. It was almost as if he had flopped down onto an invisible bed with glee. Rambunctious laughter filled the air as Eridel cuddled his stomach with his arms. There were even unshed tears that twinkled at the corner of his eyes. Who? Damn, when was the last time I laughed like that? That one question almost brought back unsavory memories, but Eridel's joy slapped it away. He righted himself and looked at the cloud like he was looking at a priceless treasure. The reason Eridel was so excited was because the cloud before his very eyes was actually the same kind of existence that Sierra was. An anomaly. At least, that's what he had decided to call them. In truth, they were entities that were even more aberrant than abominations. Anomalies were formed when extremely rare and coincidental phenomena occurred at the same time in the same location, creating an abnormal life form that was formed from the most primary element that took part in its creation. In this case, the anomaly was formed when a cloud had come into contact with multiple substances and essences along with a vast amount of the Iridius world's soul-flavored magical energy. Now, it was a living cloud. A cloud that contained sentience that could later on develop into sapience and the ability to cultivate, just as Sierra and other life forms could. From the gist of things, the cloud's primary affinities were water, wind and lightning, which were all powerful in their own right. However, unlike Sierra, this cloud did not inherit Eridel's memories nor the avatar that the little girl had gained straight from the jump. Its mind was as empty and pure as a newborn baby, and this baby was currently looking back at Eridel with curiosity by using its innate spirit sense that the beast races gained at Realm 2 and enlightened races gained at Realm 4. Just like Sierra, the cloud had inherited the ability to create contracts, which it would eventually be able to do when it unlocked its inheritance that the system had given it. Eridel could most certainly feel it because it came from him. The system only ensured that the cloud reached a certain level of cultivation before it could use its most essential ability as an anomaly of the Iridius world. It was also the system that made the creation of the anomalies more concrete and the one that prevented it from getting Eridel's memories. Sierra's creation was an accident on Eridel's part, but the cloud's creation was a coincidental natural process that the system had encoded onto the world. Kind of like the difference between Eridel giving energy to plants and the system encoding plants the ability to siphon energy from the sun. Of course plants already have photosynthesis and the system has nothing to do with it. Just take it as an example. Eridel had programmed the system in a way that made it somewhat independent, so unless he was purposefully looking, he wasn't aware of everything it did. However, it was impossible for the system to truly go against his plans for the world. It had no ego and no wishes, only work. Eridel smiled as the cloud twisted around with both excitement and confusion. "Hello little one, I'm quite busy now so I'll have to go now, but I'll make sure to come back and visit later. For now, take this name as a gift, Cleo." Cleo flashed with bright lightning as a strange but comforting energy briefly coursed through its intangible body along with a system announcement that rang out in its head, congratulating it on gaining a true name. Everybody that Eridel had named was given the same announcement, an announcement that they had gained or the name that they already had, was a true name. A name given by the world itself. And there was power in a true name. Eridel's body disintegrated into sparks of light as he deactivated his avatar. Eridel sighed with relief as he gave a cursory glance over the rest of the world. Some crazy things were going on but nothing on the level of the abomination of the north. Perfect. Now that there were many figures at the fourth realm, the world would soon level up and enter the mid-world realm, so he wanted nothing to go wrong. As mentioned before, residents are a world's lifeblood and the greater they are, the better the world. In correspondence to the amazing achievements of the Iridius world's residents, the mid-world realm evolution was just around the corner. But despite the joyous news, Eridel was having complex feelings. Eridel wasn't blind to the fact that he and consequently the Iridius world were abnormal. The strange magical energy and complex lifeforms never seen before in any other part of the universe were just a few of the things that could affect how the world's evolution changed. The more concerning fact was that the group of fourth realm lifeforms that were pushing the world into a mid-world were actually meant to push the world into a high world. Never forget that low worlds were barren of magic and were just like any other small planet that didn't even know of the existence of cultivation. Only the Iridius world had mechanisms that behaved like a mid-world. In fact, if you didn't take its size into consideration, you could say that the Iridius world was much greater than any other mid-world despite being a low world. Who knew what the world's evolution would cause? On top of that, Eridel had never seen a world evolve before. These things were just far too rare and took too long to happen for the mere Eridel, who had only lived for 2 millennia, to ever see. Even the strange artifact that had changed Eridel's life all those years ago refused to provide any knowledge on the event. Eridel decided to put these thoughts at the back of his head before turning attention to a special group of dragons that had been sleeping for over 100 years. What will come will come. Central Continent, Dragon Mountain, Heavenly Dragon Flame Cave. Within the Heavenly Dragon Flame Cave sat many spectacular figures that would be able to single-handedly wreak havoc across entire tribes and clans, with a few even wielding the power to eradicate entire species. However, they all sat like docile lambs behind the biggest and most beautiful dragon in front of them, the one and only Crystal Dragon King. The Dragon King didn't pay them a lick of attention and focused on the task at hand. He was already used to being surrounded with such reverent gazes and didn't bother to acknowledge them. Right now, he was at probably the most important moment in his life and wanted zero distractions to disturb him because if he failed, his life was forfeit. The Dragon King looked at the grand violet-colored flame in front of him with a solemn resolution. Even if he could go outside and cause carnage across entire races, he was right to be wary now in the face of this flame. Because what he was actually planning on doing was something that no sane life form would ever even dream to do or even think about. He wanted to devour and assimilate the whole Heavenly Dragon Flame. Right now, he was focusing on raising his affinity with the flame to the max, something which despite his world-class talent and constant dedication, had taken him over 100 years. But it wouldn't be long now and in any moment he would be ready. Ha! The Crystal Dragon King let out a long sigh as he deepened his comprehensions on the earth flame before him. The lowest level of a natural flame produced by the planet, nothing in existence could create these and they could only be formed naturally, or that would be the case if Eridel, the world itself didn't have the ability to create them whenever he wanted. The flame before the Dragon King was just an earth-rank flame and even then, it was a continental treasure that would cause the whole world to go crazy with desire to possess it. It was also because of this flame that the Dragon King was having to fend off the attacks of Draco and the rest of his abnormal flying snakes. The reason he had decided to actually go forth with this dangerous endeavor was because even though he was stronger than Draco, he didn't dare to kill him at all. He still remembered the ridiculously large snake who had tormented him for a few years before leaving, and even if that was many decades ago, he didn't dare to provoke her ire. Naturally, the giant snake was Yorma, and she had left him with a serious mental scar. His hope was that with the full power of the earth rank flame that the dragon clan called the Heavenly Dragon Flame, he would be able to finally get rid of the shadow in his heart, defeat Yorma, kill Draco, and slaughter the rest of their divergent snake races for good. He didn't consider those abnormal flying snakes as dragons at all, even if they had the feeling and slight physical traits of one. The Dragon King shook his head before closing his eyes to amplify his concentration. This was not the time for idle thoughts, especially not such terrifying ones. 2 days later. The Crystal Dragon King opened his eyes to reveal one of the most beautiful pair irises on the planet. It is time. He gave a telepathic message to all the dragons behind him to leave the premises. He had seen a few of the other supreme dragons become realm 4 enlightened beasts, and he was sure that if he survived the consumption of the Heavenly Dragon Flame, it would push him over that edge and he would also become an enlightened beast, in which case it would much better if the other dragons escaped. Just thinking back on those wrathful strikes from the sky still gave him chills to this day. The Dragon King softly closed his eyes before opening them again with a ruthless look in his eyes. The glare that he had given to many foes, he was now giving to himself? Well, considering the circumstances, he was indeed about to be viciously ruthless to himself. The Dragon King stretched to his full height with his wings spread out and roared with all the dignity of an almighty Dragon King that had colonized entire races, before charging straight at the violet-colored flame. In a mysterious underground cave that wasn't too far away from the Dragon Mountain, a mysterious and flabbergasting scene was taking place. 10 breathtakingly gorgeous dragons could be seen making their way up a set of steps that led to the outside world. Of the 10 dragons, 9 were dark red in color, with the last and biggest one being a luminous gold. 7 of those dark red dragons were roughly 1.7 meters long, with an aura of brutality that seemed to want to attack anything around them. The other 2 dark red dragons were much larger in size, being 4 meters long, with their horns and claws being black in color and swirling with destruction laws that looked like neon red fireflies, but they had 2 contrasting auras that somehow wanted to achieve the same thing: destruction. The female one had an aura that was actually quite mellow and calm like a lake, and yet, there was an undeniable promise of fatality from this lake that made it look like it wanted to drown you until even your soul dissolved. On the other hand, the male had a fiery and volatile aura that seemed to want to extinguish everything in existence. And yet, just like the other 8 dark red dragons, they followed the golden dragon in front without quarrel. The golden dragon was female and had beautiful resplendent scales that lacked any of the blemishes that the dusty environment were promising. The dragon's horns and claws were crystal-like and a much lighter yellow in color than the scales. They were also similarly surrounded by the essences of creation that looked like golden fireflies and gave a feeling of impervious might. The golden dragon was bigger than the rest of them, being 5 meters long, and on top of that had a much more abnormal aura that, whilst gave a calm feeling, seemed to change around a lot like an elusive aurora in the sky. It was extremely ethereal. They were obviously the 9 destruction dragons, including Kalmilla and Eshma, alongside the only creation dragon in the world, Gaia. For some reason, Gaia had achieved dominance over the rest of the group and no one seemed to dispute it. Their cultivations were still the same as before, all the destruction dragons being stage 2 magic beasts, with Gaia being at stage 3. But surely she wouldn't be able to resist if they all ganged up on her, right? What happened back there? Soon, they made it up the last step and re-entered the forest they were born in and left the dark underground behind. With each breath, the fresh smell of earth, plants, dew and other beasts entered their noses and they shivered with glee. Only Gaia and Kalmilla remained indifferent to the new sensation. Eshma, however, started growling with murderous intent and even started to make his way over to the closest beast, only for his head to be slapped to the ground by the impatient Gaia. Thok! His head smacked against the ground with a moderate impact that actually made him dizzy. When he eventually got up, he shook his head to regain his senses before roaring with anger. Eyes blazing, nostrils flaring and everything. Rea dash. Bang! Only to be slapped much harder than before. In fact, if the floor wasn't so hard his head would be buried. Only then did the most wrathful dragon of destruction forcefully restrain himself, which in itself was simply remarkable. His nature was just so volatile that trying to calm down would always be a Herculean effort, but he did it now. He glared at the resplendent golden dragon before him, who looked right back. Boom! An avalanche of primordial fear swamped his entire senses like a waterfall of dread. It was to the point that darkness crept up his vision and prevented him from seeing anything other than himself in Gaia's golden eyes. There was something in those eyes that terrified him so fatally that he trembled with fear without daring to move. Only when he quickly lowered his head in absolute submission did the fear start to subside. Even then, he still couldn't stop shaking, and he was finding air was harder than ever to inhale. Even though nothing happened, he felt like he had just overcome a great calamity. In Gaia's gaze, there was a certain indifference, an indifference that was so heavy that it created some kind of new unidentifiable emotion that could only be likewise found in Eridel's eyes. It was the gaze of someone who knew exactly what you were capable of doing, and how woefully, terribly, and absolutely insignificant you were in comparison. If a god were to ever look at a microorganism that hadn't even achieved a proper body yet, it would probably have this kind of face. Gaia turned to look at the rest of her dragon siblings, one by one, with all of them avoiding her gaze, before looking back at Eshma, who was still trembling. She shook her head and let out a very human sigh before walking forward again. None of them dared to disobey the silent order to follow, and unhesitatingly followed closely. In the silence of their palpable fear, only the sound of Eshma's low whimpers could be heard. What a bother! Gaia shook her head once more. She didn't really want her siblings to be afraid of her, but she knew the effects of the laws of destruction. Those who had affinity with those laws would always be crazy and would only listen to absolute might. If she didn't do anything, that foolish brother of hers would have charged right into stage 8 magic beast. Unlike the others who were completely unaware of magic energy, she already knew what cultivation was. Reumble. Every dragon turned their head back to see the entrance to the cave that they had just left collapse in on itself, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Gaia bobbed her head to the side and dodged a small rock that would have hit her before narrowing her eyes. Was that a god? Is there a god watching me? But how can that be? My bone age is 127, and there was certainly no magic energy 127 years ago. That was why I had to resort to almost killing myself. Even if the world evolved right after I was forcefully put to sleep and gained magic energy, 127 years is not enough for even a Realm 2 cultivator to appear. Talk less of a god. The dragon roughly shook her head in frustration. Arg, my thoughts are too slow. I need to increase my soul cultivation as soon as possible. Wait, whose primordial essence did I absorb back then? This world is too weird. Was there a god back there? Wait, it might have been an immortal from another world. Could he still be here? Wariness flickered through the dragon's eyes before she gathered herself and focused back on her path. She needed to find a shelter as soon as possible. It was then that she noticed the status of the plant life around her. Am I in a sacred land? But even for a sacred land, this is way too much. How can every tree, herb, and plant already possess magic energy? The world has not possessed magic energy for more than 127 years. Even though her face remained the same the entire time, her mind was in absolute turmoil. This world was just way too st. Boom. Gaia almost didn't want to look up. She had honestly seen enough. She was already flabbergasted, and she could confidently say that she hadn't felt this way in a very, very long time. But the shockingly familiar aura that she could sense was simply just provoking her. Gaia looked up, and what she saw made her freeze so abruptly that it looked like she had been petrified. Atop gigantic mountain that reached into the skies, a glorious dragon covered in purple crystal scales soared into the air with majestic might. However, even from here you could see the terrible burn injuries that covered its whole body. However, its cultivation was rising exponentially, and stage 1 of the enlightened beast realm, 4th realm for beasts, seemed to be just around the corner. On top of that, the beast seemed to have also reached the 2nd stage in anatomy refinement. Even then, both while extremely shocking to the mysterious golden dragon, wasn't the main source of her shocked attention. Gaia gulped with disbelief before arranging her disordered thoughts into coherent words. An earth flame? Gaia watched with astonishment as the majestic crystal dragon wreathed in violet-colored flames soared into the air. She couldn't understand how a world who had not seen magic energy for more than 127 years could possibly produce an earth flame. Such things normally took at least 1,000 years to form, and yet here she was, witnessing an enlightened beast successfully assimilate with the precious flames in a world like this. Could this dragon be a foreign invader as well? Gaia just couldn't believe that such a low-level world could keep producing such results. It didn't make sense. The crystal dragon maintained its position in the air with its wings whilst looking to the sky with intense focus. As the burn injuries began to fade thanks to the obviously recent upgrade in anatomy refinement, new scales replaced the tarnished ones and the true beauty of the crystal dragon began to reveal itself. A crystal dragon, indeed impressive, especially so for this world. At the very least, even if this world is so abnormal, there is nothing here that I haven't seen before and I should be okay. Gaia sighed in relief. Even before she arrived in this world she had already had her future goals planned out and she didn't want any deviations. However, even though the world she had arrived in was way out of her expectations, it actually turned out to work in her favor. She wasn't a beast in her past life, so when she first opened her eyes she was disappointed. In truth, her most primary dissatisfaction was the fact that almost all the cultivation techniques and skills in her memory were now redundant, and on top of that, she could no longer absorb magic energy from the air but now had to eat it from essence-rich foods such as meats and herbs. That in itself was fine, but where would she find such coveted treasures? Moreover, as a newborn, could she even fight to possess them if she was even lucky? Alas, reality seemed to paint a different picture and fate seemed to favor her. Apparently every herb in sight was a magic one, and unless she was lazy there shouldn't be a situation where she found herself unable to gather strength. As a beast, this entire world, or at least this forest, because she hadn't seen outside of it, was an absolute paradise. Gaia began to think back on her plans to calibrate the ones that needed to be adjusted to the new reality presented before her. And she found herself troubled, like trying to look at a ridiculous maths equation. Her soul was not the same as before, and it was extremely hard to connect with the vast amount of intricate thoughts that went into creating a single step of a plan. It was very confusing. I'll just have to adjust as I go, just like back then when I was mortal. At the very least, I am still able to cultivate my soul dash. Shock ran through Gaia's senses as she found herself suddenly at risk of sudden doom. Every muscle in her body tightened with tension as she forced herself to look up at the sky where she sensed the danger coming from. Above the awaiting crystal dragon king, a cloud of the purest white swirled into existence. In the middle of the cloud there was a large hole that was filled with a golden magic circle. However, Gaia was unfamiliar with that term and thought, a rune formation? What is going on? Gaia was once more dumbfounded as she peered at the ominous yet heavenly-looking cloud that seemed to be preparing something. And from the solemn expression on the crystal dragon's face, she could decipher that whatever was coming was not going to be a dance in the wind. The crystal dragon king couldn't help but let a trace of fear creep into his heart. He had flown up here with so much confidence after overcoming the ordeal with the heavenly dragon flame, thinking that if he could tame that flame then the tribulation that was sure to come would be nothing in comparison. But fate decided to give him a tight slap to the face. The crystal dragon king could only watch with helplessness as the tribulation cloud that was already bigger than any other tribulation cloud he had ever seen just kept on growing. He had actually forgotten that depending on the being who received the tribulation, the size and power of it was increased or decreased. Obviously, gaining the untried power of the heavenly dragon flame along with the breakthrough in his anatomy refinement was what was causing his perilous situation. Right now, he was really beginning to dread the close distance that he himself had made with the cloud and wished that he was on a hard stable ground where he could increase his safety. Alas, he was already here and it would be asinine to turn his back to the obvious danger above him. Resigning to his fate, he gritted his teeth and glared at the tribulation cloud above him, more specifically the golden magic circle in the center. I'm sure I can withstand the first strike. With that I can use the force to once again reach the ground and regather myself. As for the second and third, hopefully the heavenly dragon flames can fix the problems that they have caused. The magic circle pulsed. Here it comes. Ruua dash. The crystal dragon king roared towards the tribulation to rev himself up only to be cut off by a flash of golden light that filled his entire vision. Boom. NNNGGH. The crystal dragon king groaned in agony as the essence from the tribulation racked itself through his body. It felt like being burned all over again and he was really beginning to feel tired of all this pain. However, it wasn't over yet, and when his senses were restored he found himself plummeting to the ground at a speed that would turn him into paste if he made contact. Spreading out his wings, the crystal dragon king managed to slow down his descent before crashing through the canopy of trees and straight into the ground. Thok! Crack! The sound of meat slapping a hard surface and cracking bones was heard as the dragon king made contact with the earth. There were even a few cracks on the floor, which was a testament to the dragon's growing strength. However, he had obviously taken quite a bit of damage and it was unknown how that would affect the success of his tribulation. NNNGH. The Crystal Dragon King let out a groan of pain in a strangely awkward manner. The impact of the collision was so bad that it left him winded and incapable of voice, preventing him from making a single peep during the painful crash. It was only now that he was able to freely groan in pain. Huh. Cock. The Crystal Dragon King took in lungfuls of air, trying to regain his bearing before he felt a wave of discomfort which prompted him into letting out a huge cough. Splat. Blood and what seemed to be small globs of flesh? Or organs? Splattered onto the ground as the Dragon King emptied his gullet. Look at me, the king of fools. I'm so foolish that I would even fly straight into a tribulation. None can surpass me. When it comes to stupidity, I have no predecessors and I'll never have successors. I, the king of bloody fools. Roar. The Crystal Dragon King roared with anger as disappointment and frustration vibrated its way through his body. The Dragon King took in a large gulp of air, preparing to let out his growing age with a dragon breath when, flash. The world around him brightened for a brief second and the Dragon King froze like a deer caught in headlights. It was as if someone had flicked only a light and then turned it off again a second later. However, the Crystal Dragon King knew without a doubt that the tribulation magic circle had just pulsed. 2 more of such things and he was going to have a very unhappy experience. Again. Each time he had watched someone undergo a tribulation, he had noticed that before each of the 3 strikes, there would be 3 pulses that looked like they were either threatening you or warning you. Well, it was all the same. The Crystal Dragon King had also wondered if each pulse could be some kind of energy-gathering tactic, something that allowed the tribulation to make those 3 consecutive beams of light. Alas, it was impossible to confirm and he was running out of time for idle thoughts. The Dragon King released the energy he gathered for the dragon breath and dispersed it around his body, fortifying his natural defense and recovering his injuries. For some reason, the speed in which his injuries healed was faster than before. Not by a lot, but it was enough for him to notice. The Crystal Dragon King didn't think too much and attributed the effect to the strange essence that had been seeping into his body ever since he was struck by the tribulation light, and he was right. Regaining a majority of his strength, the Crystal King sat up on his hind legs in preparation for the incoming tribulation light. Flash. There it goes again, the Crystal Dragon King thought as he glared up at the tribulation cloud. Gaia looked towards the savage cloud with her jaw almost hanging. She had already rounded up her siblings and found shelter by the time the Crystal Dragon King had taken his first tribulation light. But that did not stop fear from soaking her body when she witnessed it. At first, she thought for certain that there was still an immortal being here and for some reason it was attacking the Crystal Dragon. However, the notion immediately evaporated when she felt the aura of the tribulation strike. It was like nothing she had ever had the ability to sense before. Part of it felt ancient, a lot of it felt divine, some of it like punishment and even more like retribution. But without a doubt, the most important and attention-grabbing parts, there was the feeling of fate and fortune. As an ex-immortal, Gaia knew that although immortals were all-powerful and were able to do pretty much whatever they pleased, there were a few rules that even they never dared to skate around. One of them was, no matter what the situation, no matter how damned your future, no matter how powerful you were, don't mess with fate. And don't mess with fortune. Of course, there were a few exceptions to the rules, like the legendary seers, beings that had the ability to look into the future and make decisions that changed fate based on whatever they saw, but there were like 1 or 2 of them in the entire galaxy. How could any one of such distinguished individuals be in a world like this, no matter how strange it was? It was ludicrous. On the other hand, there were actually numerous techniques and even items that could affect one's fortune. But unless you wanted to suffer a fate worse than 1,000 years of fun with the devil, you better not touch them. And yet here she was, witnessing the manipulation of fate and fortune right before her very eyes. How did this even happen? That cloud does not possess the aura of an immortal at all. All attacks, whether ejected or not, will always possess the aura of their creator, so how can this be? And why these intense punishment and retribution? Gaia was so terrified that a faint rickety sound of her bones shaking could be heard. In fact, because of her knowledge on how serious the situation was, she was more scared of the tribulation than anyone else. So what does one do when they reach their breaking point with no help in sight? Gaia interlocked her claws and tightly shut her eyes in prayer. Gods above Segothia, please save this lost little lamb. As Gaia gave a brief prayer, she couldn't help but think of the gods she was praying to and the world that they originated from, planet Segothia. Ever since she had become an immortal, she had stopped praying. Although her respect for the gods remained, it was just so awkward to pray so devoted to someone on her level, so she decided to stop completely. Naturally, the gods weren't affected by the loss, such a thing was a pittance. They were more interested in allying with the new immortal who, like the others, had the ability to leave the world any time they wanted and gather otherworldly treasures. The mutually beneficial alliance between gods and immortals was a practice that occurred in many worlds, and the Sagothia world wasn't any different. When Gaia finished her prayer, a formless and invisible energy departed from her body and shot into the distance. I wonder if they can receive my faith all the way from here, Gaia thought as she stared up at the tribulation cloud that pulsed for the third time. Although Gaia couldn't feel or see the peculiar energy since she was immortal now, she knew exactly what would happen when she had decided to pray. In truth, she was one of the few individuals that knew that gods actually got stronger the more faith they gathered, and knew they could feel it when, boom, when you prayed to them. Some of the more powerful gods had the ability to retain their loftiness when immortals ascended and employed such individuals to act as their apostles in foreign worlds, gathering faith for their god who continued to grow stronger and stronger. It was a joyous occasion for a god when they started gaining faith from a new world, because it generally meant that their power plateau was going to experience a big jump. But how could Eridel allow such a thing? Eridel sent out his primordial essence outside the planet's atmosphere, where it gathered around the formless energy created from Gaia's prayer. With a single thought, the energy was dissipated and forever unable to complete its journey. Eridel couldn't help feeling a little annoyed. Ever since the creation dragon had woken, he had witnessed each and every peculiarity it performed. It didn't take much for him to guess her true identity as a reincarnator, and even an ex-immortal at that, and it made him a little wary. Now, there were two people on his planet whose thoughts and intentions he couldn't read like a book. Gaia, and the abomination of the north. Actually, he couldn't read the thoughts of the other regular schmegular abominations either, but it was clear as day that they were insane and only had destruction on their minds. The abomination of the north was very much sane and very much capable of scheming whatever it wanted. How many brains that were functional and sometimes powerful did it assimilate into itself? The abomination was not normal at all. It was to the point that it had become one of the most intelligent residents on the planet. And on top of that, it did not have the side effect of a multiple personality disorder that its powers might have implied. It was truly a bizarre existence. But Eridel's inability to read their thoughts was not what was causing him agitation at all. In fact, it actually pleased him that there were at least two people on his planet that he could have honest conversations with. What was disturbing him was the early introduction of faith energy, the energy that Gaia had created when she had prayed to her gods. For obvious reasons, Eridel didn't want to be discovered by outside forces. His world was too young and his residents too weak. Although his planet could be considered a strong mid-world, it was nothing in comparison to what would arrive if that piece of faith energy arrived at its destination. Any world that could provide the magic energy needed for a resident to rise to immortality was without a doubt a law world. So you could imagine the situation. Eridel was very aware of the calamity that had just flown over his head, and it was for this reason that he was peeved. The only reason that Gaia's head was still attached to the rest of her body was because Eridel had plans. Again, he always had plans. But these plans were without a doubt the most dangerous ones he had ever dared to formulate. Plans that could end up with him losing everything. Or, they could end up with him taking possession over an entire law world. But as he always liked to say, with great peril comes great gifts. Ha 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 ha. Gaia was currently looking at the wretched body of the crystal dragon with sympathy. His entire body was charred black with thick smoke billowing into the air. It was as if he had slept a whole 24 hours on a bonfire. But in reality, it had taken a whole 3 strikes from that strange cloud, and with each of them being more terrifying than the last. It was only after the 3rd strike did the cloud disappear, but Gaia wasn't sure if he would survive whether a 4th one came or not. She had already realized that the talented dragon was probably one of her brothers, and it caused her heartache to see such a scene. Her entire family was massacred in her previous life when she was still immortal, and it always jabbed at her soul. In her next life, she had sworn that she would embrace and protect her new family, but the situation was already like this. Who knew what they faced in the many years she was asleep? The thought caused frustration to swell in her heart, which only multiplied when she realized how out of control her emotions have been since she had awoken. Ever since she had become an immortal, the number of times her emotions had been swayed like this could be counted with one hand. Very, very few things could affect her emotions, but in just one day she seemed to come across a plethora of them. How aggravating. Gaia roughly shook her head before forcefully quelling her emotions. She wanted to see if her brother was still alive, and it was best to keep a calm mind, preparing for the worst. I hope he's okay. I don't wanna. Did his body just ee? Gaia watched with astonished eyes as the body of the crystal dragon began to float. It was clear that the dragon was still unconscious because of the limp manner he hung in the air, so how was he moving? Numerous scenarios such as the attacker confiscating the body and perhaps a hidden treasure on the crystal dragon's body activating in self-defense flickered through Gaia's mind like a tornado, but she was unable to confirm anything. Just as she was wondering if she could find a way to help, the magical energy in the area began to behave erratically. Wadash. A spontaneous air pressure flattened the grass and shoved at the bushes and trees as the winds howled. And even more shocking than that was ridiculous amounts of magical energy that began surging towards the crystal dragon's body. Gaia's heart jumped as she envisioned her brother dying from an overinflation of magical energy, or becoming an abomination, which was just as bad, when she witnessed with her own two naked eyes the scene of her brother soaking up untold amounts of magical energy like it was nothing. The jaw of the creation dragon was once again left hanging as she watched her brother absorb absurd amounts of magical energy for a whole 5 minutes. This magical energy wasn't generated out of thin air, so that left thousands of meters around the crystal dragon king completely barren of magical energy. Areas like this were called dead magic zones, and to Gaia's bewilderment, she happened to be close enough to be encompassed by it. Could there truly be a magic or divine treasure on his body? Brother's body is way too weak to attract and absorb such a crazy amount of magical energy, so it has to be. Alas, simply drawing in magical energy in vain wasn't the purpose of the tribulation, and the crystal dragon's body began to change as the barrier to the fourth realm collapsed. He was evolving. His body grew, rising from 40 meters tall and 60 meters long to a whopping 100 meters tall and 150 meters long, which was definitely a daunting size for an enlightened beast in the first stage. Every piece of burnt flesh and every single scale, including the reverse one, were forcefully peeled from his body before disintegrating into ashes that flew along with the wind currents. But not even 10 seconds later did new flesh and scales regenerate in a form that was many times more grandiose than before. They were purple as usual, crystal-like as well, but each scale had a certain thickness to it that lacked the illusion of brittleness that ordinary crystals had. There was also a lava-like glow to them that made them look like they somehow had an unbearable heat trapped within, which was definitely different to before. His horns, claws and tail spike were shattered and replaced anew in a similar form, being a darker purple than the scales and releasing a periodic pulse. However, they were bigger than before and definitely had visible violet-colored flames that swished around within. It was the transparent nature of the crystals that enabled them to be visible and threatening to all who looked. In fact, they released both a sharp and searing aura that threatened to cause laceration to any that got close. The reborn crystal dragon king opened his eyes, and that alone would have caused heart attacks in weaker beings. Two purple blazing eyes that lacked pupils revealed themselves as good contenders of the sun. Other than the white scara, they were like two boiling balls of fire that wanted everything in creation to burn. The crystal dragon king flapped his mighty wings and soared into the air, opening his maw filled with razor-like teeth and roaring into the air with the majesty and elation of a beast king that had just risen. The violet-colored flames of the heavenly dragon flame were ejected out of his mouth as he flexed his new dragon breath. Clearly, the heavenly dragon flames had assimilated into the DNA of the crystal dragon king. The crystal dragon king was ecstatic. The risk that he bargained for had come back in full. The reason why he waited till reaching the 9th stage of the seeking beast realm, other than to reach a level that would prevent his implosion, was so that if he had the chance to evolve, he would assimilate the flames into his very DNA. He was very aware of the difference between newborn dragons born from parents that had evolved with strange perks and parents that didn't. That was why he waited till this very day. Foregoing the advances of the female dragons and waiting until he conquered the heavenly dragon flames before he indulged in such activities, it was also that his future children that would be the princes and princesses of the royal dragon family would have unlimited potential. He honestly felt like crying tears of joy, but it was a devious glint that showed in his eyes instead. He very clearly remembered the gossip of the females that were beginning to think he was incapable. It was the most embarrassing moment of his life, but now, no more. Humph. I'll show those little girls just how capable I am. Humph. Just as he was going to swoop down, he felt a change within his mana and he froze. If one could see the skin beneath the scales on his face, they would laugh at how quickly it was paling. The Crystal Dragon King noticed the familiar essence in his body that for some reason had yet to fully assimilate with the rest of his mana. Is the tribulation not done with me? No. It was not. Wait. That absurd form that the second, supreme dragon on the second peak, and the rest gained, could it be? Indeed. The evolution just now was the experience that any beast crossing into a new realm could go through if they were lucky enough. But this was not the effect of the tribulation. Whoosh! The Crystal Dragon King's body rapidly shrank as a multitude of changes took place all over his body. The bones and flesh in the Crystal Dragon King's body began rearranging themselves to take on a strange form. On top of that, most of his scales were receding into his body and eventually pale pearl-like skin was revealed. I knew it. I'm gaining a form similar to the humans, the Crystal Dragon King thought with a scrunched-up face. The pain of his body forcefully doing things that it hadn't done before was indeed immense, but what had he just come out of? That's right, a battle with the heavenly dragon flame followed by a battle with the tribulation lights. He was so overreacting to pain and he just wanted to get this over with. At the very least, he knew from the experience of the other Supremes that he would only feel pain twice. Once when he was transforming into a human, and once more when he transformed back into a dragon. It should be relatively smooth after that. Purple-colored shoulder-length hair gushed out of his skull along with eyebrows and eyelashes which caused the Crystal Dragon King surprise even if he knew it was coming. Hairs and furs were the quality of mammals and didn't show the same love to the reptiles, so it was quite interesting to suddenly gain them. The Crystal Dragon King wobbled his head, causing his hair to swish around to his amusement as his body transformation finished its last touches. Just as the others said, I have indeed lost quite a bit of strength in this form. However, I find it quite nice. I can do a lot of things with this. The Crystal Dragon King held his hands out in front of them before closing and opening them. For all intents and purposes, the Crystal Dragon King now looked like a human. 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 dexterous hands, a relatively short neck and an oval head. Delicate feet, and finally, unlike his previous hemipenes, he now only had one penis and it was freely hanging out. That was what worried him the most. What if it got cut off? Never. He would never let that happen. But on the off chance that it did get cut off, he would have to kindly ask the culprit to cut off his head too. No way to create life equals no way to continue life. That was his new motto. Gaia was as still as a statue, eyes watching the new form of her brother with soulless eyes. Never in her entire life had she ever seen something so bizarre. When the Crystal Dragon King evolved and fused the heavenly dragon flame into his DNA, she had been very impressed. It was extremely rare to come across an earth flame and even rarer to tame it. As for the amount of people who could assimilate such a thing into their DNA, even if she recalled all the worlds she had visited, she only needed one hand to count the number of such beings that she had merely heard about, talk less of seen with her own 2 eyes. Now her brother wasn't just a crystal dragon, but something more of a crystal flame dragon, or if you wanted to be fancy, a heavenly flame crystal dragon. Although he wasn't quite as special as her, a creation dragon, something she was still giddy about, he was still an extremely talented being, and if he wasn't killed prematurely he would definitely become a galaxy-renowned elite. But this? What is the meaning of this? Gaia gazed at the figure of her brother's new form. Although he had a completely humanoid figure, no one would ever mistake him for being a human. He had scales that reached down from his elbows to his wrists, with a little more extending to the back of his hands but leaving his palms and fingers free, quite a lot like ranger bracers. The same pattern repeated itself in his legs from his knees to his ankles like greaves. Both his fingernails and his toenails were long and sharp like claws and carried the same dark purple color along with an aura of sharpness and fatality that his previous claws had. Scales also patterned the sides of his waist, his entire back till the back of his neck and peeking to the sides as well, but that was it. Clearly, they were more focused on covering his most vulnerable areas. There weren't any scales on his chest because that was one of the easiest areas to defend along with his head. On top of that, the dragon still retained his glorious wings that were folded behind his back. With a thought they could cover the front of his body and the hard protective crystal scales would protect him. He also retained his horns which pierced towards the sky with unwavering might along with his daunting tail that could cause heart palpitations in anybody. Anyone could tell that the tail spike at the end was one of, if not the most dangerous thing on the entire Dragon King's body. The heavy-looking crystal looked so sharp that it felt like it could puncture right through the fabric of space. Other than those spine-chilling features were the more regular ones. A musculature that would give Adonis a run for his money, pearl-like skin and shoulder-length silky hair. His eyes were also the same as before, looking like two orbs of fire that looked like it would start shooting lasers at any moment. And last but not least were his genitals. Clearly the same penis that any human male could have, but Gaia struggled to believe that any of the humans she had seen in the past could reach the same size. But that of course was not what was causing Gaia so much surprise. The truth was, beasts just didn't transform like this. Gaia could not believe her eyes. Never in her entire life had she ever seen or even heard of a beast that could gain a humanoid form. Beasts were beasts and they would remain that way for the rest of their lives. But what was the situation before her eyes? Madness. Gaia was losing her mind and she felt like she was in a dream. This world was too much. Sure, beings like beastkin and such existed. But those were actually humans who had taken the blood or something similar of a powerful beast and not only managed to survive the consummation, but also managed to mutate as well. But even then, let's say for example that some human drank the blood of the Dragon King and mutated as a result. At most, other than the strength and talent, they would at most gain horns and a handful of scales, most of the time not even that, and only got a full house of sharp nails. It depended on how compatible they were with the bloodline, but it would never reach this state. Wings, tails, horns and scales nearly covering the whole body. Gaia could not for the life of her believe what she was seeing. How could this possibly be? Who can tell me what's going on? Ding! The Dragon King has overcome the tribulation lights and successfully ascended to the fourth realm. This has given him the access of an enlightened form. Gaia's body seized up. Fear assailed her and her fight or flight instincts immediately kicked in. Who was that? Get out of my mind. Somebody had somehow managed to invade her mind without her knowing and she was extremely afraid. As an ex-immortal, she knew how dangerous or even fatal it could be when someone had access to your mind, so she never played when it came to her mind. All residents have received the Eridel system as a gift from the gods. The Eridel system has been designed to help you in your everyday life. Please check status. Gaia didn't know that was the same message that everyone was first given when the system first arrived. Who are you? Clearly, she wasn't in the state to listen. The Eridel system has been designed to help you in your everyday life. Please check status. I don't care what you have to say. Tell me who you are. The Eridel system has been designed to help you in your everyday life. Please check status. What the fuck? By now Gaia could tell that something here was clearly not normal, so she tried to calm down and think. But it felt like trying to forcefully calm yourself down when a gun was touching the back of your skull. She tried one more time. Who dash? All residents have received the Eridel system as a gift from the gods. Only to be ignored once more. The Eridel system has been designed to help you in your everyday life. Please check status. What is that dash? Gaia's frantic thoughts were temporarily interrupted by the sight of the Dragon King flapping the wings of his back and soaring into the sky, most likely returning to his peak at the top of the Dragon Mountain. What is a status? Ding! Status. Name, Gaia, true name. Titles, none. Race, creation dragon. Cultivation, third stage magic beast. Anatomy refinement, none. Combat strength, unknown. Bloodline, dragon of creation. Physique, none. Affinities, creation, 100%. Elements, none. Laws, creation, 1%. What? Gaia was shocked. Again. Some kind of strange screen, and yes, she knew what a screen was. She had seen multiple worlds, had appeared before her eyes and had a somewhat detailed description of her entire makeup. Gaia? Is that me? She felt an exhilarating rush of energy course through her veins when she said the name, which only served to confuse her. What was dash? Congratulations. You have been gifted the true name, Gaia. Gaia was somewhat peeved at being interrupted again, but the emotion was washed away when she heard the full sentence of the female albeit stoic voice. What is a true name? Gaia asked. She was beginning to get a grasp of the situation and now she was hungry for information. There was no need for stupid questions like when she was named, she needed vital information and for some reason the voice in her head was more than willing to answer. Gaia's eyes shone bright. A true name is? Above the center of the central continent was a strangely small cloud that didn't move at all. Sat upon the cloud was a man that possessed transcendent beauty, or rather handsomeness. The attraction of his appearance was so heavy that one would think that it was impossible for such a being to be born by a mother even if she were the holy mother of beauty. Surely a god must have crafted him from the ground up. Obviously, this was Eridel's avatar. Hee Eridel laughed. He had an odd feeling that someone was praising him. Oh, some people have begun praising the lands thinking they'll get some more resources. The fuck? Do they know about worship or is this just a coincidence? Looking at the state of their situation, they are indeed in need of the help of the supernatural. Even in his avatar Eridel still possessed the omniscience of a world's consciousness and he was currently looking deep into the South Continent where a bunch of monsters were kissing the ground or doing silly dances. Even without context or his all-seeing gaze, it didn't take much to understand that they were crying over the state of their absolutely barren territory. Their land was dry and all the magic herbs were nowhere to be seen, the trees too were obviously dead and even the air was brittle. On top of that, all the magic energy in the area was gone. This was quite a little bit beyond a dead magic zone. Well, fuck them, next time they'll be more careful. Eridel remembered what happened to that place. That ravenous blood fiend, Crying Ghost had thought he was slick when he broke through to the 9th stage of the core refinement realm 3 for the enlightened races, and entered the 1st stage of the soul refinement realm 4 for the enlightened races. He tried to run up on the Emperor of Monsters, breaking their treaty, only to be clapped right back. It was quite funny now that he looked back on it. The Crying Ghost had to pretend that it was just a friendly spar and that the treaty was still valid. Eridel remembered the veins almost popping on Azura's face as he struggled to hold himself back, giving a forced laughter and saying something like, no worries good neighbor Crying Ghost, it was just a friendly bout. It was then the Crying Ghost's turn to have a forced smile and twitchy eyes. He hated it when people addressed him by the strange title that he found on his status page, so he enforced that people only called him Ghost. Any blood fiend that called him the full Crying Ghost was ruthlessly murdered whilst anyone from a foreign race was tortured then murdered. It was apparently his way of showing care to his race and they actually believed it. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't do a single thing to the Emperor of Monsters and had to swallow his pride. Unlike the humans, the denizens of the South Continent were quite experienced in the art of deceit. They had to be if they wanted to survive in such a place where evil and chaos was just as common as oxygen. Alas, even if they had come to a truce once again, that wasn't going to get rid of the damage they had caused to the area. They were both Fourth Realm cultivators and that meant that they actually had the ability to do damage to the planet now. It needn't be said why the monsters in that territory were so desperate. Eridel could laugh at the situation now, but he wasn't laughing back then. He'd almost smited the fools when they destroyed his beautiful scenery. It was almost like being scarred by 2 rebellious cells. Just kidding, but he was indeed peeved back then. Now, fuck y'all, find a way yourselves. He was still annoyed. Eridel turned his attention back to the land below him. The land was absolutely overflowing with essence, it was to the point that certain objects and items had a golden glow. Color of the Iridius world's magic energy, other world magical energy is blue. Magical herbs were so abundant that the grass looked like it had been completely replaced, even the life forms in the area casually walked over them or slowly grazed like they were really just common grass. Golden magic stones were also casually left around as if they were a bunch of pebbles and the surrounding trees towered into the sky like mountains. Clearly, the abundant magical energy in the area was creating astonishing effects that the rest of the world was missing out on. What kind of wonderland was this? A sacred land. Even if this area was already good before her arrival, I didn't really expect one to form so soon. Well, considering the number of Fourth Realm cultivators, a few more of these should form before I evolve. Eridel's honeyed voice sounded out as he casually twisted his hair. To be honest, he didn't need to be in his avatar at all. But he wanted to have a nice feel of things before he went back into his upcoming seclusion. He had quite a few things that he wanted to implement into the world before he evolved and became a mid-world, so the seclusion was a must if he wanted to finish in time. Eridel gazed at a particular group of beasts below that were radiating powerful auras. There were 3 species in this place and the one that Eridel was looking at was a group of snakes. Every single one of the snakes here could be considered an elite in this world and the weakest one here was actually a stage 9 spirit beast. If Eridel didn't know better he'd definitely say that they were the strongest group of life forms in the entire world. But weren't quite there yet. Places like the depths of the sea and the North Continent were kind of hard to top. The second strongest group here was actually a bunch of dragons. Divine dragons to be exact. The new mutative race that was originated by Draco and the close cousins of the Snake clan. Eridel could see the said Draco messing around with Lily and the now 4-headed Hiculu as their big sister Yorma. Fuck, she's super big now, casually watched. Eridel stared at her for a few seconds because of something that he noticed, and the beast actually tensed. She looked around warily as if scouting for danger, but Eridel knew he was the cause and he was thoroughly impressed. Most residents didn't sense him unless he did something that was impossible to ignore, like speaking out loud or directly appearing in front of them. It wasn't that he was hiding his presence, nay, it was in fact the result of the residents subconsciously protecting themselves. Just like with the two twin stars before they received Eridel's gifts, most residents completely deleted his existence from their memory. So for Yorma too. It must be because of that thing on her head. As expected, she fully tamed it. In the middle of the majestic snake's forehead was a vertical third eye. The eye was previously closed but now open to reveal an eerie red iris that shined ominously with murderous intent. It was also looking right at him. The eye shined brighter and Eridel knew things were about to go left. Whoops. Eridel giggled and dissipated his avatar at the same time. The cloud beneath him turned to stone and shattered. Yorma glared at the debris and ignored the startled looks of her siblings. She could have sworn she sensed something more than a mere cloud, even if the cloud was clearly strange. That was not what she felt at all. She couldn't even remember what she felt, but she knew that the cloud was not it. What is going on? She thought. She couldn't help but feel that something was seriously wrong. However, when she saw the slightly panicky looks of her siblings, she decided to forget it. She was the role model of everybody here, and when she appeared distressed, everyone else started to feel wary. Because they knew that if there was something that she could not deal with, it was something that could eradicate their entire race. Unfortunately, she didn't realize that she was forgetting permanently. Phew, she's quite a big girl now. Eridel remembered when she was merely 10 or so meters long. Now, she was over 300 meters long, and she wasn't even a celestial beast. Just like Apis, all celestial beasts were innately large, and anyone with knowledge of them would think that Yorma was part of the same group. But she was not. She was a normal enlightened beast with an enlightened form, humanoid transformation, and everything. The only reason she was so big was because of her special bloodline that had benefited from the tribulation and managed to evolve. No longer was it the earth-devouring bloodline, but now it was the sky-devouring bloodline. This new bloodline not only allowed her to absorb more essence from whatever she ate, but now she could directly eat magical energy from the air too. She could just open her large maw and whoosh, free magical energy incoming. It was simply too crazy. As for Yorma's siblings, they were pretty amazing too. Despite the fact that Draco was extremely lacking in terms of cultivation when compared to the other two, his potential and talent were not in any way inferior. Even though he was a first-stage seeking beast, his strength could compare to Lily, who was first-stage enlightened beast. Despite the fact that this was because Lily was not really that good of a fighter, this did not take away from the fact that he could fight against someone a whole realm above him. The reason for this was because of the various things that boosted his strength. First was obviously the laws of fire, then came the bloodline that he gained from the Wind Supreme Dragon, and finally was the anatomy refinement that Reiko had taught him. Both of the two sworn brothers had been undergoing anatomy refinement on the mountain that never stopped getting struck by lightning all this time. Unfortunately for Draco, all these things that boosted his strength also stalled the speed of his cultivation. As mentioned before, it was much harder to enrich mana that was formed from laws with regular magical energy. On top of that, when absorbing magical energy, a portion of it was passively absorbed into the flesh, but with beings with powerful bloodlines, the portion of the magical energy that was absorbed into the flesh was drastically increased and not enough went into the beast core or otherwise replacement, E.G mana core. Last but not least was the anatomy refinement. The thing about anatomy refinement was that you had to get hurt badly and wrestle your life from the grip of death to level up. But for a beast to cultivate their mana, it needed to eat essence-rich foods. It was kind of hard to eat and get struck by lightning at the same time. Despite all of that, Draco was doing pretty well for himself. As for Lily and Hikulu, they were first-stage enlightened beasts and were naturally powerful. Lily's face had been completely healed without any blemishes and only continued to become more beautiful. Her illusion abilities had also become very powerful, and she was a terrible foe to have to go against. Hikulu had regrown the head that had chopped off when he became a seeking beast, but unfortunately, he didn't get the total of 4 heads that the seeking beast realm promised him. Because of the fact that one head was already chopped off, the 4th head he would have gained went into replacing the lost one. Only when he became an enlightened beast did he get a 4th head. Besides that, his poison had become extremely terrifying, and it was to the point that even Yorma was wary of it. Eridel's planet core pulsed as he grew excited. With such figures in his planet, he was destined for a magisterial future. Eridel finally looked at the third species that was allowed access to this sacred land. And unsurprisingly, they were a group of humans. In this world, due to the great amount of dexterity, agility and gracefulness that a human was able to employ, they were used as valuable servants that all the beast lords tried to obtain. It got to a point that the more powerful beast kings used them as a show of authority. Some conversation amongst the more shameless beast kings went something like, "You see my servants? They're great, right? No, I'm not boasting, I just wanted to talk to you about the effort I spent in obtaining them. No, not I'm actually helping you. One day you might find a group of humans like I did and I can show you how to capture them. I mean, even though it was quite easy for me, it might be hard for, hey, where are you going?" Eridel wasn't surprised that the humans were treated like this because they were essentially powerless. Their only good ability was the ability to escape, but even then they still ended up being enslaved on a daily basis. However, things will not always be like this. Eridel briefly thought about two special individuals in the North Continent before refocusing back on the sacred land. A sacred land was a land blessed by essence and always affected the area around it based on the primary essence in the territory. For example, if the majority of the essence here was fire energy, then many of the herbs and maybe even some of the trees would gain fire affinities. On top of that, the magic stones produced in this area would also be packed with fire energy instead of magical energy and would have at least 10 times the effect on individuals with the corresponding mana affinity. Normally, such spectacular locations like this would be very, very hard to form and even rarer to see. You certainly would never see one in a world that had only had magical energy for 127 years, but here it was, a complete and undeniable sacred land. However, Eridel was not delusional. He knew it wasn't because of anything special on his part and he wasn't about to get pompous. The true benefactor of this sacred land was actually Yorma, the territory owner herself. As previously mentioned, when an owner of a territory was strong enough, his presence would begin to permeate into the territory. When this happened, the territory would give off an almost imperceptible aura and faint smell that was reminiscent of the owner, usually acting as a deterrent to predators with keener instincts. But it was deeper than that. When the owner gained power that was finally capable of affecting the world, for now, Realm 4 power, the faint magical energy that they released during cultivation no longer dissipated into the atmosphere. Now, it would assimilate and corrupt the magical energy in the environment. Slowly, yes, but surely. The longer they stayed, the bigger the effect on their domain. Magic stones, magic herbs and even the weaker magic trees would gain the affinities of the new magical energy in the environment. On top of that, the density, quality and quantity of the magical energy would all rise exponentially, regardless of whether the magical energy gained a new affinity or not. And this is what we call a sacred land. Unfortunately for Yorma's sacred land, there was no special affinity to be found. This was because even though Yorma was amazingly talented, she herself didn't have any special affinity at all. Even with the evil eye of petrification and the sky-devouring bloodline, her mana was formed from regular magical energy and not much would change that. But despite a lack of an affinity, she was still very powerful. Back when she had to help Draco in the war with the dragons, it was the acquisition of the evil eye that she found in this very land that was keeping her so busy. The land was already high in magical energy, so when she broke through to the fourth realm, her presence was able to quickly turn it into a sacred land. Eridel could think of a few more sacred lands that would probably start popping up soon, and one of the more interesting ones was the Western Forest owned by the Dragon Clan. Despite the Crystal Dragon King being the newest enlightened beast there, he was definitely the strongest and could be considered the owner of the territory. However, there were other enlightened beasts in the territory, and just because they weren't the main owners didn't mean they didn't have any effect. The amalgamation of their individual affinities would make the sacred land even more precious than others, and the products produced would be various and amazing. But the Crystal Dragon King was the main owner in the end, so his crystal and fire affinities would be a lot more prevalent. Eridel was filled with glee at such prospects, but he soon thought of one particular individual and his mind almost lagged. The Abomination of the North. Eridel felt like face-palming. The Abomination of the North, whilst sealed, was still very much alive, or as alive as something harboring undeath essence could be at least. He should be more than capable of making his own sacred land, and the thought caused Eridel to feel fear. Never in his entire 2 lives had something he had created caused him fear, but apparently there really was a first time for everything. Even when he was a mere mortal back on Earth and he was up close and personal with all manners of dangerous things he created, he had never felt like this. Damn. This abomination is really amazing. Ha ha ha. Eridel laughed, but he was still worried. What? What the hell would happen if an abomination like that was able to form a sacred land? It terrified him because if things went out of control it might end up being too late, but it also excited him at the same time. He really wanted to know. Eridel focused on a certain area in the western region of the North Continent where all those undead trees were and zoomed in a little bit to find the sealed abomination laying flaccid in an underground cavern. And it was awake. But of course Eridel knew that, he sealed its powers and mobility, not its consciousness. But yes, the abomination's presence was freely pervading a large expanse of land, prompting unknown changes that Eridel had no clue about. Wow, Eridel thought as he gazed at the abomination with a hint of awe. Eridel backed up his point of focus and found his attention on the forest of death, or rather, the forest filled with the trees of death. Countless trees of death littered the forest, but Eridel knew that this wasn't because of the abomination itself, but actually that ridiculously large tree in the center. In truth, that particular tree was the result of the slime abomination using the reproduction skill and fusing the new slime with a tree just like how he did with the humans to create the original undead. Fortunately, the success rate of a tree fusing with such a thing was completely abysmal and only one managed to survive, becoming the giant spirit tree that it was today. This very tree, however, was definitely the cause of the rising amount of the trees of death. Its presence had seeped into the forest long ago and continuously caused the trees in the vicinity to either die or mutate. Most of them died. But because of this, the forest had become a haven for the original undead that had been released from their mind control. No longer could their ancestor force them to do what it wanted like puppets using the bloodline domination skill, their minds and wills were completely free. Now, they could do whatever they wanted and a lot of them were even able to gain the memories of their lives before their mutation. But unfortunately, this didn't cause them to turn over a new leaf in the slightest. They were still cruel and cannibalistic and their memories only made this worse. Now, they had gained the wittiness of those that were once prey and the ambition to gather power that ensured they were never again put in the same situation. Never having to run from predators from day to day and never having to cater to their superiors like slaves. So not only did they increase the amount of times they left the forest of death to go and hunt, but now, they even devoured each other. Since they had gained a washed-down version of the assimilation skill that the slime abomination had from their bloodline, they were able to steal power from those that they ate and sometimes, on rare occasions, even skills. These guys had absolutely no sense of camaraderie and would even devour their own ancestor if they could, so it was only natural that they would frequently devour each other for more power whenever they could. Eventually, only 37 original undead were left alive. Well, technically there were 38 if you included the giant tree of death, but it's better to consider it in a class of its own. So yeah, there were 37 original undead left now, but each and every one of them were very powerful. Having survived till now they had all gone through all kinds of life and death situations and they gained power from every win. They were also very cunning and highly intelligent. At this point they knew that to kill each other now would be too difficult, a fight between them would be extremely dangerous and would leave the winner on his last legs, free for someone else to take all the benefits. They obviously didn't want that, so they had decided to establish a truce, forming an alliance or to be more accurate a council. Each of them had hordes of undead under their control by now and they could be said to be the ultimate leaders of all the undead on the continent. It was quite similar to the Demon Kings and the monsters on the South Continent, but Eridel knew that if there was a confrontation between the two forces, the monsters would be finished. Apart from Azura, the Emperor of Monsters himself, the 37 original undead lords were much stronger than the 87 Demon Kings. And on top of that, the original undead were, well, undead. Very hard to kill. With these kinds of beings along with the giant tree of death and the abomination of the north himself, it was safe to say that their territory would become a sacred land very quickly. But Eridel found it somewhat of a struggle to address something like that as a sacred land. If you asked me, it's more of a cursed land. Eridel chuckled at his little joke before turning serious again. He had a job to complete and he was on a clock. Thankfully, the few things that he wanted to implement were either nothing too crazy or he had already started them a while ago. His Manifestations of 7 Deadly Sins project, for example, He had been working on this project ever since he grasped the concept of anomalies, and it was going to be wild. His Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse project was also a work in progress. Nothing much needed to be said about this. He was planning on invading other worlds. Although Eridel had been content with his world, his position was still fallible and he needed more power. He wouldn't be able to hide for very long, and sooner or later, his planet would be revealed to the galaxy. Hopefully, I'll be ready by then. If only he knew. Although the other projects were cool, Eridel was currently excited about another one that would cause groundbreaking changes that would shoot his world light years ahead of others. The others were still going to take a bit more time, but this one wouldn't, and Eridel was absolutely ecstatic. This project was none other than the Soulmates project. The Soulmates project was exactly what it sounded like, two individuals with such a deep chemistry that it was as if they were made for each other. But Eridel's plan had much more layers to it than that. First of all, this almost completely removed the issue of romantic and sexual relationships on his planet. In some other worlds, the relationships between man and woman were almost like a fight of who can manipulate who, or who could best appease their instincts in the relationship. Would it be the woman who could find the best man that she most admires and loves and confine him into a monogamous relationship? Or the man who could find the most supportive and lovely woman who would be completely loyal to him whilst at the same time letting him smash hoes on the side? There were deeper biological reasons as for why the two genders had such desires, but there was no need to go into that. Because of the two contradicting desires, a lot of relationships crumbles, and in the worst-case scenario, a child is involved. When husbands and wives fought all the time, unattended children raised as degenerates, and the desire for love was in such shambles, one's hope in life itself tended to collapse over time. A man's age-old instinct was to protect his woman or women along with his children, whilst it was a woman's age-old instinct to submit to the most powerful man that was willing to impregnate them and then raise the resulting children to adulthood. Most people knew it, but they refused to acknowledge it when the indoctrination of society preached otherwise. But the result was a terrifying fate that most wouldn't expect. As a broken king once said, "In a world without love, death means nothing." But that was actually the second most important reason for Eridel's Soul Mate project. Other than vastly reducing the problem of romantic relationships, Eridel planned for the Soul Mates project to get rid of a problem that he considered far more troublesome: the hybrid stillbirths. It was a universal problem that a child created from parents of two different species had a high likelihood of meeting fatality before birth. And even if the child was born successfully, there was a good chance that they were going to be either disabled, crippled, disfigured, or mentally inept. Very, very rarely were they ever born complete. But when they were, knowing this, it was obvious that the situation with the devils born from the blood fiends and monsters was abnormal. How could it be possible that whilst the other races were experiencing endless issues when crossbreeding, the union between the monsters and blood fiends was experiencing countless successes? Were the gods looking upon the devils with loving smiles? Obviously not. In truth, only a select few monster races were actually capable of giving birth to those devils. These monsters had a very high libido, a 100% childbirth success rate, and it was not restricted to inbreeding. If these monsters could find someone that was compatible, they could certainly create a hybrid, but at a cost. Taking the devils for example, even though they had immaculate physical strength and even greater potential, they were completely incapable of utilizing mana. It couldn't be helped. Even though they were born successfully, the defaults of a hybrid could not be completely avoided. But it caused one to wonder, what would happen if a devil was born as part of the 1% that was born perfectly whole? Born with the benefits of both races and weaknesses of neither. In any case, the monsters that were capable of creating such feats were the experiments of Eridel that he called breeders. Quite some time ago, he had been pondering over the hybrid problems and had decided to start a few experiments. The breeders were the only success. But make no mistake, the title of breeders was not limited to a single monster race but rather a group of them. One of these breeders was the goblin race. They, along with others like the ogres and orcs, were able to create hybrids with other races and with almost zero stillbirths. Eridel had considered it a success. If only he could understand the full depths of the menaces he had created. Life was not something to be played with so easily. Not only would soul mates achieve the most perfect chemistry in any way possible, they would be able to give birth to perfect hybrids if they were from different races. This was Eridel's most important goal when it came to the Soul Mates project. But there was a problem. Eridel could not guarantee that soul mates would be able to find each other. If they were born in separate continents and were unable to travel the world, there was nothing that could be done, and Eridel didn't dare to help. He had previously thought of utilizing fate to make them somehow find each other if one of them didn't die first, but he vanquished the idea as if it were an evil spirit trying to possess him. Just thinking of the tribulations that they would have to endure had made Eridel's core dim. However, although it was not a certainty that soul mates would find each other, the closer they were to each other the more they would feel the bond. That was the best he could do. After achieving contact and sealing the pact though? Even if one of them had entered an alternate dimension, the other would still be able to track them. Soul mates were almost inseparable. Thinking about it, they should also be able to complement each other's strength when close to each other. Even automatic dual cultivating when performing the deed is possible. Soul mates are indeed amazing. If I'm successful, they should be one of the biggest backbones of this world. Eridel thought with glee. Alas, I have planned for far too long, and it is time to finally put everything in motion. Eridel gave a cursory glance around the whole world and only planned to give a quick glance at the situation, but he couldn't stop himself from pausing at 3 specific locations. The underground cavern of the slime abomination, the ever-turbulent depths of the sea, and finally, the center of the central eastern forest where Sierra's lake lay. I'll see you soon, I suppose. 1 week later. Even though Eridel was in seclusion, the rest of the world was still very much active. Over on the Dragon Mountain, the crystal dragon had begun mating with other females, dead set on spreading his royal genes. Unfortunately, he was only able to mate with other female supremes because of his ridiculous size. Even the female supremes were unable to cope with his size unless they transformed into their enlightened bodies along with the king, evening out the playing field. Hopefully, this wouldn't affect the birth of the children. In the North Continent, the twin stars of hope were trekking across the lands like nomads as they gathered supporters and preached of overcoming the threat of the undead, killing their oppressors, retaking their continent, and blah blah blah. On a more interesting note, both stars had been teaching their techniques to their subordinates that were willing to fight. But what was more exciting was the actual cultivation techniques and martial skills that they had been passing down. Gabriel taught hand-to-hand combat to the majority and weapon arts to the rare few who found their own sticks to substitute as weapons. Sarakiel, on the other hand, wasn't yet able to teach her mind-blowing skills because of the lack of necessary tools, but she was able to teach the cultivation technique that she had learned from Jonas, allowing the humans to show the true might of enlightened beings. Over in the East Continent, the High Human Queen commanded her brethren as they constructed buildings with tools never seen before. But hold on, looking at the layout of the territory, could this be the beginning of a city? Nay, it was more than that. With the smaller village-looking areas in the far distance, this could well add up to being the first ever true kingdom. Marvelous!